Chapter 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Clarica. 8 Cousins by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 13. Cozy Corner. Vacation was over. The boys went back to school, and poor Mac was left lamenting. He was out of the darkened room now, and promoted to blue goggles, through which he took a gloomy view of life, as might have been expected, for there was nothing he could do but wander about and try to amuse himself without using his eyes. Any one who has ever been condemned to that sort of idleness knows how irksome it is, and can understand the state of mind which caused Mac to say to Rose in a desperate tone one day, "Look here! If you don't invent some new employment or amusement for me, I shall knock myself on the head as sure as you live." Rose flew to Uncle Alec for advice, and he ordered both patient and nurse to the mountains for a month, with Aunt Jessie and Jamie as escort. Poky and her mother joined the party, and one bright September morning 6 very happy-looking people were aboard the express train for Portland. 2 smiling mammas, laden with luncheon baskets and wraps, a pretty young girl with a bag of books on her arm, a tall, thin lad with his hat over his eyes, and 2 small children, who sat with their short legs straight out before them, and their chubby faces beaming with the first speechless delight of truly traveling. An especially splendid sunset seemed to have been prepared to welcome them, when, after a long day's journey, they drove into a wide, green dooryard, where a white colt, a red cow, 2 cats, 4 kittens, many hens, and a dozen people, old and young, were gaily disporting themselves. Every one nodded and smiled in the friendliest manner, and a lively old lady kissed the newcomers all round, as she said heartily, "Well, now, I'm proper glad to see you. Come right in and rest, and we'll have tea in less than no time, for you must be tired. Lizzie, you show the folks upstairs. Kitty, you fly round and help father in with the trunks, and Jenny and I will have the table all ready by the time you come down. Bless the dears, they want to go see the pussies, and so they shall." The 3 pretty daughters did "fly round," and every one felt at home at once, they were all so hospitable and kind. Aunt Jessie had raptures over the home-made carpets, quilts, and quaint furniture. Rose could not keep away from the windows, for each framed a lovely picture. And the little folks made friends at once with the other children, who filled their arms with chickens and kittens, and did the honors handsomely. The toot of a horn called all to supper, and a goodly party, including 6 children besides the Campbells, assembled in the long dining-room, armed with mountain appetites and the gayest spirits. It was impossible for any one to be shy or sober, for such gales of merriment arose, they blew the starch out of the stiffest, and made the saddest jolly. Mother Atkinson, as all called their hostess, was the merriest there, and the busiest, for she kept flying up to wait on the children, to bring out some new dish, or to banish the livestock, who were of such a social turn that the colt came into the entry and demanded sugar, the cats sat about in people's laps, winking suggestively at the food, and speckled hens cleared the kitchen floor of crumbs as they joined in the chat with a cheerful clucking. Every one turned out after tea to watch the sunset till all the lovely red was gone, and mosquitoes wound their shrill horns to sound the retreat. The music of an organ surprised the newcomers, and in the parlor they found Father Atkinson playing sweetly on the little instrument made by himself. All the children gathered about him, and, led by the tuneful sisters, sang prettily till Poky fell asleep behind the door, and Jamie gaped audibly right in the middle of his favorite. "Coo," said the little doves, "coo," said she, all in the top of the old pine tree. The older travelers, being tired, went to "bye low" at the same time, and slept like tops in homespun sheets, on husk mattresses made by Mother Atkinson, who seemed to have put some soothing powder among them, so deep and sweet was the slumber that came. Next day began the wholesome out-of-door life, which works such wonders with tired minds and feeble bodies. The weather was perfect, and the mountain air made the children as frisky as young lambs, while the elders went about smiling at one another, and saying, "Isn't it splendid?" Even Mac, the slow coach, was seen to leap over a fence as if he really could not help it, and when Rose ran after him with his broad-brimmed hat, he made the spirited proposal to go into the woods and hunt for a catamount. Jamie and Pokey were at once enrolled in the Cozy Corner Light Infantry, a truly superb company, composed entirely of officers, all wearing cocked hats, carrying flags, waving swords, or beating drums. It was a spectacle to stir the dullest soul when this gallant band marched out of the yard in full regimentals, with Captain Dove, a solemn, big-headed boy of 11, issuing his orders with the gravity of a general, and his Falstaffian regiment obeying them with more docility than skill. The little Snow children did very well, and Lieutenant Jack Dove was fine to see. So was Drummer Frank, the errand boy of the house, as he rub-a-dub-dubbed with all his heart and drumsticks. Jamie had trained before, and was made a colonel at once, but Pokey was the best of all, and called forth a spontaneous burst of applause from the spectators as she brought up the rear, her cocked hat all over one eye, her flag trailing over her shoulder, and her wooden sword straight up in the air, her face beaming and every curl bobbing with delight as her fat legs tottered in the vain attempt to keep step manfully. Mac and Rose were picking blackberries in the bushes beside the road when the soldiers passed without seeing them, and they witnessed a sight that was both pretty and comical. A little farther on was one of the family burial spots so common in those parts, and just this side of it Captain Fred Dove ordered his company to halt, explaining his reason for doing so in the following words: "That's a graveyard, and it's proper to muffle the drums and lower the flags as we go by. And we'd better take off our hats, too. It's more respectable, I think." "Isn't that cunning of the dears?" whispered Rose, as the little troop marched slowly to the muffled roll of the drums, every flag and sword held low, all the little heads uncovered, and the childish faces very sober as the leafy shadows flickered over them. "Let's follow and see what they are after," proposed Mac, who found sitting on the wall and being fed with blackberries luxurious but tiresome. So they followed, and heard the music grow lively, saw the banners wave in the breeze again when the graveyard was passed, and watched the company file into the dilapidated old church that stood at the corner of 3 woodland roads. Presently the sound of singing made the outsiders quicken their steps, and stealing up, they peeped in at one of the broken windows. Captain Dove was up in the old wooden pulpit, gazing solemnly down upon his company, who, having stacked their arms in the porch, now sat in the bare pews singing a Sunday-school hymn with great vigor and relish. "Let us pray," said Captain Dove, with as much reverence as an army chaplain, and folding his hands, he repeated a prayer which he thought all would know, an excellent little prayer, but not exactly appropriate to the morning, for it was, "Now I lay me down to sleep." Every one joined in saying it, and it was a pretty sight to see the little creatures bowing their curly heads, and lisping out the words they knew so well. Tears came into Rose's eyes as she looked. Mac took off his hat involuntarily, and then clapped it on again, as if ashamed of showing any feeling. Now I shall preach you a short sermon, and my text is, "Little children, love one another." I asked Mamma to give me one, and she thought that would be good, so you all sit still, and I'll preach it. You mustn't whisper, Marion, but hear me. It means that we should be good to each other, and play fair, and not quarrel as we did this very day about the wagon. Jack can't always drive, and needn't be mad because I like to go with Frank. Annette ought to be horse sometimes, and not always driver, and Willie may as well make up his mind to let Marion build her house by his, for she will do it, and he needn't fuss about it. Jamie seems to be a good boy, but I shall preach to him if he isn't. No, Pokey, people don't kiss in church or put their hats on. Now you must all remember what I tell you, because I am the captain, and you should mind me." Here Lieutenant Jack spoke right out in meeting, with the rebellious remark, "Don't care if you are. You'd better mind yourself, and tell how you took away my strap and kept the biggest doughnut, and didn't draw fair when we had the truck." "Yes, and you slapped Frank. I saw you," bawled Willie Snow, bobbing up in his pew. "And you took away my book and hid it, 'cause I wouldn't go and swing when you wanted me to," added Annette, the oldest of the Snow trio. "I shan't build my house by Willie's if he don't want me to, so now," put in little Marion, joining the mutiny. "I will 'tis dimmy, and I tore up my hat 'tause a pin picked me," shouted Pokey, regardless of Jamie's efforts to restrain her. Captain Dove looked rather taken aback at this outbreak in the ranks. But being a dignified and calm personage, he quelled the rising rebellion with great tact and skill, by saying, briefly, "We'll sing the last hymn, 'Sweet, sweet good-bye.' You all know that, so do it nicely, and then we will go and have luncheon." Peace was instantly restored, and a burst of melody drowned the suppressed giggles of Rose and Mac, who found it impossible to keep sober during the latter part of this somewhat remarkable service. 15 minutes of repose rendered it a physical impossibility for the company to march out as quietly as they had marched in. I grieve to state that the entire troop raced home as hard as they could pelt, and were soon skirmishing briskly over their lunch, utterly oblivious of what Jamie, who had been much impressed by the sermon, called "the captain's beautiful tech." It was astonishing how much they all found to do at Cozy Corner, and Mac, instead of lying in a hammock and being read to, as he had expected, was busiest of all. He was invited to survey and lay out Skeeterville, a town which the children were getting up in a huckleberry pasture, and he found much amusement in planning little roads, staking off house lots, attending to the waterworks, and consulting with the selectmen about the best sites for public buildings, for Mac was a boy still, in spite of his 15 years, and his love of books. Then he went fishing with a certain jovial gentleman from the West, and though they seldom caught anything but colds, they had great fun and exercise, chasing the phantom trout they were bound to have. Mac also developed a geological mania, and went tapping about at rocks and stones, discoursing wisely of strata, periods, and fossil remains, while Rose picked up leaves and lichens, and gave him lessons in botany in return for his lectures on geology. They led a very merry life, for the Atkinson girls kept up a sort of perpetual picnic, and did it so capitally that one was never tired of it. So their visitors throve finely, and long before the month was out, it was evident that Dr. Alec had prescribed the right medicine for his patients. Chapter 14. A Happy Birthday. The 12th of October was Rose's birthday, but no one seemed to remember that interesting fact, and she felt delicate about mentioning it, so fell asleep the night before wondering if she would have any presents. That question was settled early the next morning, for she was awakened by a soft tap on her face, and, opening her eyes, she beheld a little black and white figure sitting on her pillow, staring at her with a pair of round eyes very like blueberries, while one downy paw patted her nose to attract her notice. It was Kitty Comet, the prettiest of all the pussies, and Comet evidently had a mission to perform, for a pink bow adorned her neck, and a bit of paper was pinned to it bearing the words, "For Miss Rose, from Frank." That pleased her extremely, and that was only the beginning of the fun, for surprises and presents kept popping out in the most delightful manner all through the day, the Atkinson girls being famous jokers, and Rose a favorite. But the best gift of all came on the way to Mount Windytop, where it was decided to picnic in honor of the great occasion. 3 jolly loads set off soon after breakfast, for everybody went, and everybody seemed bound to have an extra good time, especially Mother Atkinson, who wore a hat as broad-brimmed as an umbrella, and took the dinner horn to keep her flock from straying away. "I'm going to drive auntie and a lot of the babies, so you must ride the pony. And please stay behind us a good bit when we go to the station, for a parcel is coming, and you are not to see it till dinner time. You won't mind, will you?" said Mac, in a confidential aside during the wild flurry of the start. "Not a bit," answered Rose. "It hurts my feelings very much to be told to keep out of the way at any other time, but birthdays and Christmas it is part of the fun to be blind and stupid, and poked into corners. I'll be ready as soon as you are, Giglamps. Stop under the big maple till I call. Then you can't possibly see anything," added Mac, as he mounted her on the pony his father had sent up for his use. Barkis was so gentle and so "willin'," however, that Rose was ashamed to be afraid to ride him, so she had learned that she might surprise Dr. Alec when she got home. Meantime she had many a fine canter over the hills and far away, with Mac, who preferred Mr. Atkinson's old sorrel. Away they went, and, coming to the red maple, Rose obediently paused, but could not help stealing a glance in the forbidden direction before the call came. Yes, there was a hamper going under the seat, and then she caught sight of a tall man whom Mac seemed to be hustling into the carriage in a great hurry. One look was enough, and with a cry of delight, Rose was off down the road as fast as Barkis could go. "Now I'll astonish uncle," she thought. "I'll dash up in grand style, and show him that I am not a coward, after all." Fired by this ambition, she startled Barkis by a sharp cut, and still more bewildered him by leaving him to his own guidance down the steep, stony road. The approach would have been a fine success, if, just as Rose was about to pull up and salute, 2 or 3 distracted hens had not scuttled across the road with a great squawking, which caused Barkis to shy and stop so suddenly that his careless rider landed in an ignominious heap just under Old Sorrel's astonished nose. Rose was up again before Dr. Alec was out of the carryall, and threw 2 dusty arms about his neck, crying, with a breathless voice, "Oh, uncle, I'm so glad to see you! It is better than a cartload of goodies, and so dear of you to come." "But aren't you hurt, child? That was a rough tumble, and I'm afraid you must be damaged somewhere," answered the doctor, full of fond anxiety, as he surveyed his girl with pride. "My feelings are hurt, but my bones are all safe. It's too bad. I was going to do it so nicely, and those stupid hens spoilt it all," said Rose, quite crestfallen, as well as much shaken. "I couldn't believe my eyes when I asked, 'Where is Rose?' and Mac pointed to the little Amazon pelting down the hill at such a rate. You couldn't have done anything that would please me more, and I'm delighted to see how well you ride. Now, will you mount again, or shall we turn Mac out and take you in?" asked Dr. Alec, as Aunt Jessie proposed to start, for the others were beckoning them to follow. "Pride goeth before a fall. Better not try to show off again, ma'am," said Mac, who would have been more than mortal if he had refrained from teasing when so good a chance offered. "Pride does go before a fall, but I wonder if a sprained ankle always comes after it," thought Rose, bravely concealing her pain as she answered with great dignity, "I prefer to ride. Come on, and see who will catch up first." She was up and away as she spoke, doing her best to efface the memory of her downfall by sitting very erect, elbows down, head well up, and taking the motion of the pony as Barkis cantered along as easily as a rocking chair. "You ought to see her go over a fence and race when we ride together. She can scud, too, like a deer when we play follow the leader, and skip stones and bat balls almost as well as I can," said Mac, in reply to his uncle's praise of his pupil. "I'm afraid you will think her a sad tomboy, Alec, but really she seems so well and happy I have not the heart to check her. She has broken out in the most unexpected way, and frisks like a colt, for she says she feels so full of spirits she must run and shout whether it is proper or not," added Mrs. Jessie, who had been a pretty hoyden years ago herself. "Good, good! That's the best news you could tell me," and Dr. Aleck rubbed his hands heartily. "Let the girl run and shout as much as she will. It is a sure sign of health, and as natural to a happy child as frisking is to any young animal full of life. Tomboys make strong women, usually, and I had far rather find Rose playing football with Mac than puttering over beadwork like that affected midget, Ariadne Blish. But she cannot go on playing football very long, and we must not forget that she has a woman's work to do, by and by," began Mrs. Jessie. "Neither will Mac play football much longer, but he will be all the better fitted for business, because of the health it gives him. Polish is easily added, if the foundations are strong, but no amount of gilding will be of use if your timber is not sound. I'm sure I'm right, Jessie, and if I can do as well by my girl during the next 6 months as I have the last, my experiment will succeed." "It certainly will, for when I contrast that bright, blooming face with the pale, listless one that made my heart ache a while ago, I can believe in almost any miracle," said Mrs. Jessie, as Rose looked round to point out a lovely view, with cheeks like the ruddy apples in the orchard near by, eyes clear as the autumn sky overhead, and vigor in every line of her girlish figure. A general scramble among the rocks was followed by a regular gypsy lunch, which the young folks had the rapture of helping to prepare. Mother Atkinson put on her apron, turned up her sleeves, and fell to work as gaily as if in her own kitchen, boiling the kettle slung on 3 sticks, over a fire of cones and fir boughs, while the girls spread the mossy table with a feast of country goodies, and the children tumbled about in everyone's way, till the toot of the horn made them settle down like a flock of hungry birds. As soon as the merry meal and a brief interval of repose was over, it was unanimously voted to have some charades. A smooth green spot between 2 stately pines was chosen for the stage, shawls hung up, properties collected, audience and actors separated, and a word quickly chosen. The first scene discovered Mac in a despondent attitude and shabby dress, evidently much troubled in mind. To him entered a remarkable creature with a brown paper bag over its head. A little pink nose peeped through one hole in the middle, white teeth through another, and above 2 eyes glared fiercely. Spires of grass stuck in each side of the mouth seemed meant to represent whiskers. The upper corners of the bag were twisted like ears, and no one could doubt for a moment that the black scarf pinned on behind was a tail. This singular animal seemed in pantomime to be comforting his master and offering advice, which was finally acted upon, for Mac pulled off his boots, helped the little beast into them, and gave him a bag. Then, kissing his paw with a hopeful gesture, the creature retired, purring so successfully that there was a general cry of "Cat! Puss! Boots!" "Cat is the word," replied a voice, and the curtain fell. The next scene was a puzzler, for in came another animal, on all fours this time, with a new sort of tail and long ears. A gray shawl concealed its face, but an inquisitive sunbeam betrayed the glitter as of goggles under the fringe. On its back rode a small gentleman in Eastern costume, who appeared to find some difficulty in keeping his seat as his steed jogged along. Suddenly a spirit appeared, all in white, with long newspaper wings upon its back and golden locks about its face. Singularly enough, the beast beheld this apparition and backed instantly, but the rider evidently saw nothing, and whipped up unmercifully, also unsuccessfully, for the spirit stood directly in the path, and the amiable beast would not budge a foot. A lively skirmish followed, which ended in the Eastern gentleman being upset into a sweet fern bush, while the better bred animal abased itself before the shining one. The children were all in the dark, till Mother Atkinson said, in an inquiring tone, "If that isn't Balaam and the ass, I'd like to know what it is. Rose makes a sweet angel, doesn't she?" Ass was evidently the word, and the angel retired, smiling with mundane satisfaction over the compliment that reached her ears. The next was a pretty little scene from the immortal story of Babes in the Wood. Jamie and Pokey came trotting in, hand in hand, and, having been through the parts many times before, acted with great ease and much fluency, audibly directing each other from time to time as they went along. The berries were picked, the way lost, tears shed, baby consolation administered, and then the little pair lay down among the brakes and died with their eyes wide open, and the toes of their four little boots turned up to the daisies in the most pathetic manner. "Now the wobbins tum. You be twite dead, Dimmy, and I'll peep in and see 'em," one defunct innocent was heard to say. "I hope they'll be quick, for I am lying on a stone, and ants are walking up my leg like fury," murmured the other. Here the robins came, flapping in with red scarves over their breasts and leaves in their mouths, which they carefully laid upon the babes wherever they would show best. A prickly blackberry leaf placed directly over Pokey's nose caused her to sneeze so violently that her little legs flew into the air. Jamie gave a startled "ow," and the pitying fowls fled giggling. After some discussion, it was decided that the syllable must be "strew" or "strow," and then they waited to see if it was a good guess. This scene discovered Annette Snow in bed, evidently very ill. Miss Jenny was her anxious mamma, and her merry conversation amused the audience, till Mac came in as a physician, and made great fun with his big watch, pompous manner, and absurd questions. He prescribed one pellet with an unpronounceable name, and left after demanding $20 for his brief visit. The pellet was administered, and such awful agonies immediately set in that the distracted mamma bade a sympathetic neighbor run for Mother Know-all. The neighbor ran, and in came a brisk little old lady in a cap and specs, with a bundle of herbs under her arm, which she at once applied in all sorts of funny ways, explaining their virtues as she clapped a plantain poultice here, put a pounded catnip plaster there, or tied a couple of mullein leaves around the sufferer's throat. Instant relief ensued. The dying child sat up and demanded baked beans. The grateful parent offered $50, but Mother Know-all indignantly refused it, and went smiling away, declaring that a neighborly turn needed no reward, and a doctor's fee was all a humbug. The audience were in fits of laughter over this scene, for Rose imitated Mrs. Atkins capitally, and the herb cure was a good hit at the excellent lady's belief that "yarbs" would save mankind, if properly applied. No one enjoyed it more than herself, and the saucy children prepared for the grand finale in high feather. This closing scene was brief but striking, for two trains of cars whizzed in from opposite sides, met with a terrible collision in the middle of the stage, and a general smash-up completed the word catastrophe. "Now let us act a proverb. I've got one all ready," said Rose, who was trying to distinguish herself in some way before Uncle Alec. So every one but Mac, the gay Westerner, and Rose took their places on the rocky seats and discussed the late, beautiful, and varied charade, in which Pokey frankly pronounced her own scene the bestest of all. In 5 minutes the curtain was lifted. Nothing appeared but a very large sheet of brown paper pinned to a tree, and on it was drawn a clock face, the hands pointing to 4. A small note below informed the public that 4 a.m. was the time. Hardly had the audience grasped this important fact when a long waterproof serpent was seen uncoiling itself from behind a stump. An inchworm, perhaps, would be a better description, for it traveled in the same humpy way as that pleasing reptile. Suddenly a very wide-awake and active fowl advanced, pecking, chirping, and scratching vigorously. A tuft of green leaves waved upon his crest, a larger tuft of brakes made an umbrageous tail, and a shawl of many colors formed his flapping wings. A truly noble bird, whose legs had the genuine strut, whose eyes shone watchfully, and whose voice had a ring that evidently struck terror into the caterpillar's soul, if it was a caterpillar. He squirmed, he wriggled, he humped as fast as he could, trying to escape, but all in vain. The tufted bird espied him, gave one warbling sort of crow, pounced upon him, and flapped triumphantly away. "That early bird got such a big worm he could hardly carry him off," laughed Aunt Jessie, as the children shouted over the joke suggested by Mac's nickname. "That is one of Uncle's favorite proverbs, so I got it up for his especial benefit," said Rose, coming up with a two-legged worm beside her. "Very clever. What next?" asked Dr. Alec, as she sat down beside him. The Dove boys are going to give us an incident in the life of Napoleon, as they call it. The children think it very splendid, and the little fellows do it rather nicely," answered Mac with condescension. A tent appeared, and pacing to and fro before it was a little sentinel, who in a brief soliloquy informed the observers that the elements were in a great state of confusion, that he had marched some 100 miles or so that day, and that he was dying for want of sleep. Then he paused, leaned upon his gun, and seemed to doze, dropped slowly down, overpowered with slumber, and finally lay flat, with his gun beside him, a faithless little sentinel. Enter Napoleon, cocked hat, gray coat, high boots, folded arms, grim mouth, and a melodramatic stride. Freddie Dove always covered himself with glory in this part, and took the stage with a Napoleonic attitude that brought down the house, for the big-headed boy, with solemn, dark eyes and square brow, was the very moral of that rascal Bonyparty, Mother Atkinson said. Some great scheme was evidently brewing in his mighty mind, a trip across the Alps, a bonfire at Moscow, or a little skirmish at Waterloo perhaps, for he marched in silent majesty till suddenly a gentle snore disturbed the imperial reverie. He saw the sleeping soldier and glared upon him, saying in an awful tone, "Ha! Asleep at his post! Death is the penalty! He must die!" Picking up the musket, he is about to execute summary justice, as emperors are in the habit of doing, when something in the face of the weary sentinel appears to touch him, and well it might, for a most engaging little warrior was Jack, as he lay with his shako half off, his childish face trying to keep sober, and a great black mustache over his rosy mouth. It would have softened the heart of any Napoleon, and the little corporal proved himself a man by relenting, and saying, with a lofty gesture of forgiveness, "Brave fellow, he is worn out. I will let him sleep and mount guard in his place." Then, shouldering the gun, this noble being strode to and fro, with a dignity which thrilled the younger spectators. The sentinel awakes, sees what has happened, and gives himself up for lost. But the Emperor restores his weapon, and, with that smile which won all hearts, says, pointing to a high rock whereupon a crow happens to be sitting, "Be brave, be vigilant, and remember that from yonder pyramid generations are beholding you." And with these memorable words he vanishes, leaving the grateful soldier bolt upright, with his hand at his temple, and deathless devotion stamped upon his youthful countenance. The applause which followed this superb piece had hardly subsided, when a sudden splash and a shrill cry caused a general rush toward the waterfall that went gambolling down the rocks, singing sweetly as it ran. Poky had tried to gambol also, and had tumbled into a shallow pool, whither Jamie had gallantly followed in a vain attempt to fish her out, and both were paddling about half frightened, half pleased with the unexpected bath. This mishap made it necessary to get the dripping infants home as soon as possible. So the wagons were loaded up, and away they went, as merry as if the mountain air had really been oxygenated sweets, not bitters, as Dr. Alex suggested when Max said he felt as jolly as if he had been drinking champagne instead of the currant wine that came with a great frosted cake wreathed with sugar roses in Aunt Plenty's hamper of goodies. Rose took part in all the fun, and never betrayed by look or word the twinges of pain she suffered in her ankle. She excused herself from the games in the evening, however, and sat talking to Uncle Alec in a lively way, that both amazed and delighted him, for she confided to him that she played horse with the children, drilled with the light infantry, climbed trees, and did other dreadful things that would have caused the aunts to cry aloud if they knew of them. "I don't care a pin what they say if you don't mind, uncle," she answered, when he pictured the dismay of the good ladies. "Ah, it's all very well to defy them, but you are getting so rampant, I'm afraid you will defy me next, and then where are we?" "No, I won't. I shouldn't dare, because you are my guardian, and can put me in a strait jacket if you like," and Rose laughed in his face, even while she nestled closer, with a confiding gesture pleasant to see. "Upon my word, Rosie, I begin to feel like the man who bought an elephant and then didn't know what to do with him. I thought I had got a pet and plaything for years to come, but here you are growing up like a beanstalk, and I shall find I've got a strong-minded little woman on my hands before I can turn around. There's a predicament for a man and an uncle." Dr. Alec's comic distress was mercifully relieved for the time being by a dance of goblins on the lawn, where the children, with pumpkin lanterns on their heads, frisked about like will-o'-the-wisps as a parting surprise. When Rose went to bed, she found that Uncle Alec had not forgotten her, for on the table stood a delicate little easel, holding two miniatures set in velvet. She knew them both, and stood looking at them till her eyes brimmed over with tears that were both sweet and sad, for they were the faces of her father and mother, beautifully copied from portraits fast fading away. Presently she knelt down, and, putting her arms round the little shrine, kissed one after the other, saying with an earnest voice, "I'll truly try to make them glad to see me, by and by." And that was Rose's little prayer on the night of her 14th birthday. 2 days later the Campbells went home, a larger party than when they came, for Dr. Alec was escort, and Kitty Comet was borne in state in a basket, with a bottle of milk, some tiny sandwiches, and a doll's dish to drink out of, as well as a bit of carpet to lie on in her palace car, out of which she kept popping her head in the most fascinating manner. There was a great kissing and cuddling, waving of handkerchiefs, and last good-byes as they went, and when they had started, Mother Atkinson came running after them to tuck in some little pies, hot from the oven, for the dears who might get tired of bread and butter during that long day's travel. Another start and another halt, for the snow children came shrieking up to demand the 3 kittens that Poky was coolly carrying off in a traveling bag. The unhappy kits were rescued, half smothered, and restored to their lawful owners, amid dire lamentation from the little kidnapper, who declared that she only took them 'cause they'd want to go wid their sister Tommet. Start number 3 and stoppage number 3, as Frank hailed them with the luncheon basket, which they had forgotten, after every one had protested that it was safely in. All went well after that, and the long journey was pleasantly beguiled by Poky and Pussy, who played together so prettily that they were considered public benefactors. "Rose doesn't want to go home, for she knows the aunts won't let her rampage as she did up at Cozy Corner," said Mac, as they approached the old house. "I can't rampage if I want to for a time, at least, and I'll tell you why. I sprained my ankle when I tumbled off Barkis, and it gets worse and worse, though I've done all I know to cure it and hide it, so it shouldn't trouble any one," whispered Rose, knitting her brows with pain as she prepared to descend, wishing her uncle would take her instead of her bundles. How he did it she never knew, but Mac had her up the steps and on the parlor sofa before she could put her foot to the ground. "There you are, right side up with care. And mind, now, if your ankle bothers you, and you are laid up with it, I am to be your footman. It's only fair, you know, for I don't forget how good you have been to me." And Mac went to call Phoebe, so full of gratitude and goodwill that his very goggles shone. Chapter 15. Earrings. Rose's sprain proved to be a serious one, owing to neglect, and Dr. Alec ordered her to lie on the sofa for a fortnight at least, whereat she groaned dismally, but dared not openly complain, lest the boys turn upon her with some of the little wise sermons on patience which she had delivered for their benefit. It was Mac's turn now, and honorably did he repay his debt, for, as school was still forbidden, he had plenty of leisure, and devoted most of it to Rose. He took many steps for her, and even allowed her to teach him to knit, after assuring himself that many a brave Scotchman knew how to "click the pricks." She was obliged to take a solemn vow of secrecy, however, before he would consent, for though he did not mind being called "Gig Lamps," Granny was more than his boyish soul could bear, and at the approach of any of the clan his knitting vanished as if by magic, which frequent chucking out of sight did not improve the stripe he was doing for Rose's new afghan. She was busy with this pretty work one bright October afternoon, all nicely established on her sofa in the upper hall, while Jamie and Poky, lent for her amusement, were keeping house in a corner, with Comet and Rosa's old doll for their "childern's." Presently Phoebe appeared with a card. Rose read it, made a grimace, then laughed and said, "I'll see Miss Blish," and immediately put on her company face, pulled out her locket, and settled her curls. "You dear thing, how do you do? I've been trying to call every day since you got back, but I have so many engagements I really couldn't manage it till to day. So glad you are alone, for mamma said I could sit a while, and I brought my lace work to show you, for it's perfectly lovely," cried Miss Blish, greeting Rose with a kiss, which was not very warmly returned, though Rose politely thanked her for coming, and bid Phoebe roll up the easy chair. "How nice to have a maid," said Ariadne, as she settled herself with much commotion. "Still, dear, you must be very lonely and feel the need of a bosom friend." "I have my cousins," began Rose, with dignity, for her visitor's patronizing manner ruffled her temper. "Gracious, child, you don't make friends of those great boys, do you? Mamma says she really doesn't think it's proper for you to be with them so much." "They are like brothers, and my aunts do think it's proper," replied Rose, rather sharply, for it struck her that this was none of Miss Blish's business. "I was merely going to say I should be glad to have you for my bosom friend, for Hattie Mason and I have had an awful quarrel, and don't speak. She is too mean to live, so I gave her up. Just think, she never paid back one of the caramels I've given her, and never invited me to her party. I could have forgiven the caramels, but to be left out in that rude way was more than I could bear, and I told her never to look at me again as long as she lived." "You're very kind, but I don't think I want a bosom friend, thank you," said Rose, as Ariadne stopped to bridle and shake her flaxen head over the delinquent Hattie Mason. Now, in her heart, Miss Blish thought Rose a stuck-up puss, but the other girls wanted to know her and couldn't. The old house was a charming place to visit. The lads were considered fine fellows, and the Campbells are one of our first families, mamma said. So Ariadne concealed her vexation at Rose's coolness, and changed the subject as fast as possible. "Studying French, I see. Who is your teacher?" she asked, flitting over the leaves of "Paul and Virginia" that lay on the table. "I don't study it, for I read French as well as English, and uncle and I often speak it for hours. He talks like a native, and says I have a remarkably good accent." Rose really could not help this small display of superiority, for French was one of her strong points, and she was vain of it, though she usually managed to hide this weakness. She felt that Ariadne would be the better for a little crushing, and could not resist the temptation to patronize in her turn. "Oh, indeed," said Miss Blish, rather blankly, for French was not her strong point by any means. "I'm to go abroad with uncle in a year or two, and he knows how important it is to understand the languages. Half the girls who leave school can't speak decent French, and when they go abroad they are so mortified. I shall be very glad to help you, if you like it, for of course you have no one to talk with at home." Now Ariadne, though she looked like a wax doll, had feelings within her instead of sawdust, and these feelings were hurt by Rose's lofty tone. She thought her more stuck up than ever, but did not know how to bring her down, yet longed to do it, for she felt as if she had received a box on the ear, and involuntarily put her hand up to it. The touch of an earring consoled her, and suggested a way of returning tit for tat in a telling manner. "Thank you, dear. I don't need any help, for our teacher is from Paris, and of course he speaks better French than your uncle." Then she added, with a gesture of her head that set the little bells on her ears to tingling, "How do you like my new earrings? Papa gave them to me last week, and every one says they are lovely." Rose came down from her high horse with a rapidity that was comical, for Ariadne had the upper hand now. Rose adored pretty things, longed to wear them, and the desire of her girlish soul was to have her ears bored, only Dr. Alec thought it foolish, so she never had done it. She would gladly have given all the French she could jabber for a pair of golden bells with pearl-tipped tongues, like those Ariadne wore, and clasping her hands, she answered in a tone that went to the hearer's heart, "They are too sweet for anything. If uncle would only let me wear some, I should be perfectly happy." I wouldn't mind what he says. Papa laughed at me at first, but he likes them now, and says I shall have diamond solitaires when I'm 18," said Ariadne, quite satisfied with her shot. "I've got a pair now that were mamma's, and a beautiful little pair of pearl and turquoise ones that I'm dying to wear," sighed Rose. "Then do it. I'll pierce your ears, and you must wear a bit of silk in them till they are well. Your curls will hide them nicely. Then, some day, slip in your smallest earrings, and see if your uncle don't like them." I asked him if it wouldn't do my eyes good, once, when they were red, and he only laughed. People do cure weak eyes that way, don't they? "Yes, indeed. And yours are sort of red. Let me see." "Yes, I really think you ought to do it before they get worse," said Ariadne, peering into the large, clear eye offered for inspection. "Does it hurt much?" asked Rose, wavering. "Oh dear, no. Just a prick and a pull, and it's all over. I've done lots of ears, and know just how. Come, push up your hair and get a big needle." "I don't quite like to do it without asking uncle's leave," faltered Rose, when all was ready for the operation. "Did he ever forbid it?" demanded Ariadne, hovering over her prey like a vampire. "No, never." "Then do it, unless you are afraid," cried Miss Blish, bent on accomplishing the deed. That last word settled the matter, and, closing her eyes, Rose said "Punch!" in the tone of one giving the fatal order, "Fire!" Ariadne punched, and the victim bore it in heroic silence, though she turned pale and her eyes were full of tears of anguish. "There, now pull the bits of silk often, and cold cream your ears every night, and you'll soon be ready for the rings," said Ariadne, well pleased with her job, for the girl who spoke French with "a fine accent" lay flat upon the sofa, looking as exhausted as if she had had both ears cut off. "It does hurt dreadfully, and I know uncle won't like it," sighed Rose, as remorse began to gnaw. "Promise not to tell, or I shall be teased to death," she added, anxiously, entirely forgetting the two little pitchers gifted with eyes as well as ears, who had been watching the whole performance from afar. "Never." "Mercy me, what's that?" And Ariadne started as a sudden sound of steps and voices came up from below. "It's the boys. Hide the needle. Do my ears show? Don't breathe a word," whispered Rose, scrambling about to conceal all traces of their iniquity from the sharp eyes of the clan. Up they came, all in good order, laden with the proceeds of a nutting expedition, for they always reported to Rose and paid tribute to their queen in the handsomest manner. "How many, and how big? We'll have a grand roasting frolic after tea, won't we?" said Rose, plunging both hands into a bag of glossy brown nuts, while the clan stood at ease and nodded to Ariadne. "That lot was picked especially for you, Rosie. I got every one myself, and they are extra whackers," said Mac, presenting a bushel or so. "You should have seen Giglamps when he was after them. He pitched out of the tree, and would have broken his blessed old neck if Arch had not caught him," observed Steve, as he lounged gracefully in the window seat. "You needn't talk, Dandy, when you didn't know a chestnut from a beech, and kept on thrashing till I told you of it," retorted Mac, festooning himself over the back of the sofa, being a privileged boy. "I don't make mistakes when I thrash you, old worm, so you'd better mind what you are about," answered Steve, without a ray of proper respect for his elder brother. "It is getting dark, and I must go, or mamma will be alarmed," said Ariadne, rising in sudden haste, though she hoped to be asked to remain to the nut party. No one invited her, and all the while she was putting on her things and chatting to Rose, the boys were telegraphing to one another the sad fact that some one ought to escort the young lady home. Not a boy felt heroic enough to cast himself into the breach, however. Even polite Archie shirked the duty, saying to Charlie as they slipped quietly into an adjoining room, "I'm not going to do all the gallivanting. Let Steve take that chit home and show his manners." "I'll be hanged if I do," answered Prince, who disliked Miss Blish because she tried to be coquettish with him. "Then I will. and, to the dismay of both recreant lads, Dr. Alec walked out of the room to offer his services to the chit. He was too late, however, for Mac, obeying a look from Rose, had already made a victim of himself, and trudged meekly away, wishing the gentle Ariadne at the bottom of the Red Sea. "Then I will take this lady down to tea, as the other one has found a gentleman to go home with her. I see the lamps are lighted below, and I smell a smell which tells me that auntie has something extra nice for us tonight." As he spoke, Dr. Alec was preparing to carry Rose downstairs as usual, but Archie and Prince rushed forward, begging with penitent eagerness for the honor of carrying her in an armchair. Rose consented, fearing that her uncle's keen eye would discover the fatal bits of silk. So the boys crossed hands, and, taking a good grip of each curly pate, she was borne down in state, while the others followed by way of the banisters. Tea was ordered earlier than usual, so that Jamie and his dolly could have a taste, at least, of the holiday fun, for they were to stay till 7 and be allowed 12 roasted chestnuts apiece, which they were under bonds not to eat till next day. Tea was dispatched rapidly, therefore, and the party gathered round the wide hearth in the dining-room, where the nuts were soon dancing gaily on hot shovels or bouncing out among the company, thereby causing delightful panics among the little ones. "Come, Rosie, tell us a story while we work, for you can't help much, and must amuse us as your share," proposed Mac, who sat in the shade pricking nuts, and who knew by experience what a capital little Scheherazade his cousin was. "Yes, we poor monkeys can't burn our paws for nothin', so tell away, Pussy," added Charlie, as he threw several hot nuts into her lap, and shook his fingers afterwards. "Well, I happen to have a little story with a moral to it in my mind, and I will tell it, though it is intended for younger children than you," answered Rose, who was rather fond of telling instructive tales. "Fire away," said Geordie, and she obeyed, little thinking what a disastrous story it would prove to herself. Well, once upon a time a little girl went to see a young lady who was very fond of her. Now the young lady happened to be lame, and had to have her foot bandaged up every day, so she kept a basket full of bandages, all nicely rolled and ready. The little girl liked to play with this basket, and one day, when she thought no one saw her, she took one of the rolls without asking leave, and put it in her pocket. Here Poky, who had been peering lovingly down at the 5 warm nuts that lay at the bottom of her tiny pocket, suddenly looked up and said, "Oh!" in a startled tone, as if the moral tale had become intensely interesting all at once. Rose heard and saw the innocent betrayal of the small sinner, and went on in a most impressive manner, while the boys nudged one another and winked as they caught the joke. "But an eye did see this naughty little girl, and whose eye do you think it was?" "Eye of Dodd," murmured conscience-stricken Poky, spreading 2 chubby little hands before the round face, which they were not half big enough to hide. Rose was rather taken aback by this reply, but feeling that she was producing a good effect, she added seriously, "Yes, God saw her, and so did the young lady, but she did not say anything. She waited to see what the little girl would do about it. She had been very happy before she took the bandage, but when it was in her pocket she seemed troubled, and pretty soon stopped playing, and sat down in a corner looking very sober. She thought a few minutes, and then went and put back the roll very softly, and her face cleared up, and she was a happy child again. The young lady was glad to see that, and wondered what made the little girl put it back." "Conscience picked her," murmured a contrite voice from behind the small hands pressed tightly over Poky's red face. "And why did she take it, do you suppose?" asked Rose in a schoolmarmish tone, feeling that all the listeners were interested in her tale and its unexpected application. "It was so nice and wound, and she wanted it deftly," answered the little voice. "Well, I'm glad she had such a good conscience. The moral is that people who steal don't enjoy what they take, and are not happy till they put it back. "What makes that little girl hide her face?" asked Rose, as she concluded. "Me so 'shamed of Poky," sobbed the small culprit, quite overcome by remorse and confusion at this awful disclosure. "Come, Rose, it's too bad to tell her little tricks before every one, and preach at her in that way. You wouldn't like it yourself," began Dr. Alec, taking the weeper on his knee and administering consolation in the shape of kisses and nuts. Before Rose could express her regret, Jamie, who had been reddening and ruffling like a little turkey cock for several minutes, burst out indignantly, bent on avenging the wound given to his beloved dolly. "I know something bad that you did, and I'm going to tell right out. You thought we didn't see you, but we did, and you said uncle wouldn't like it, and the boys would tease, and you made Ariadne promise not to tell, and she punched holes in your ears to put earrings in. So now! And that's much badder than to take an old piece of rag, and I hate you for making my Poky cry." Jamie's somewhat incoherent explosion produced such an effect that Poky's small sin was instantly forgotten, and Rose felt that her hour had come. "What?" cried the boys in a chorus, dropping their shovels and knives to gather round Rose, for a guilty clutching at her ears betrayed her, and with a feeble cry of "Ariadne made me," she hid her head among the pillows like an absurd little ostrich. "Now she'll go prancing round with bird cages and baskets, and carts and pigs, for all I know, in her ears, as the other girls do, and won't she look like a goose?" asked one tormentor, tweaking a curl that strayed out from the cushions. "I didn't think she'd be so silly," said Mac, in a tone of disappointment that told Rose she had sunk in the esteem of her wise cousin. "That Blish girl is a nuisance, and ought not to be allowed to come here with her nonsensical notions," said the Prince, feeling a strong desire to shake that young person as an angry dog might shake a mischievous kitten. "How do you like it, uncle?" asked Archie, who, being the head of a family himself, believed in preserving discipline at all costs. "I am very much surprised, but I see she is a girl, after all, and must have her vanities like all the rest of them," answered Dr. Alec, with a sigh, as if he had expected to find Rose a sort of angel, above all earthly temptations. "What shall you do about it, sir?" inquired Geordie, wondering what punishment would be inflicted on a feminine culprit. "As she is fond of ornaments, perhaps we had better give her a nose ring also. I have one somewhere that a Fiji belle once wore. I'll look it up," and, leaving Poky to Jamie's care, Dr. Alec rose as if to carry out his suggestion in earnest. Good, we'll do it right away. Here's a gimlet, so you hold her, boys, while I get her dear little nose all ready," cried Charlie, whisking away the pillow as the other boys danced about the sofa in true Fiji style. It was a dreadful moment for Rose, for she could not run away. She could only grasp her precious nose with one hand and extend the other, crying distractedly, "Oh, uncle, save me, save me!" Of course he saved her, and when she was securely barricaded by his strong arm, she confessed her folly in such humiliation of spirit that the lads, after a good laugh at her, decided to forgive her and lay all the blame on the tempter, Ariadne. Even Dr. Alec relented so far as to propose 2 gold rings for the ears, instead of 1 copper one for the nose, a proceeding which proved that if Rose had all the weakness of her sex for jewelry, he had all the inconsistency of his in giving a pretty penitent exactly what she wanted, spite of his better judgment. Chapter 16. Bread and Buttonholes. "What in the world is my girl thinking about all alone here, with such a solemn face?" asked Dr. Alec, coming into the study one November day, to find Rose sitting there with folded hands and a very thoughtful aspect. "Uncle, I want to have some serious conversation with you, if you have time," she said, coming out of a brown study, as if she had not heard his question. "I'm entirely at your service, and most happy to listen," he answered, in his politest manner, for when Rose put on her womanly little airs, he always treated her with a playful sort of respect that pleased her very much. Now, as he sat down beside her, she said, very soberly, "I've been trying to decide what trade I would learn, and I want you to advise me." "Trade, my dear?" and Dr. Alec looked so astonished that she hastened to explain. I forgot that you didn't hear the talk about it up at Cozy Corner. You see, we used to sit under the pines, and sew, and talk a great deal, all the ladies, I mean, and I liked it very much. Mother Atkinson thought that every one should have a trade, or something to make a living out of, for rich people may grow poor, you know, and poor people have to work. Her girls were very clever and could do ever so many things, and Aunt Jessie thought the old lady was right. So when I saw how happy and independent those young ladies were, I wanted to have a trade, and then it wouldn't matter about money, though I like to have it well enough. Dr. Alec listened to this explanation with a curious mixture of surprise, pleasure, and amusement in his face, and looked at his little niece as if she had suddenly changed into a young woman. She had grown a good deal in the last 6 months, and an amount of thinking had gone on in that young head which would have astonished him greatly could he have known it all, for Rose was one of the children who observe and meditate much, and now and then nonplus their friends by a wise or curious remark. "I quite agree with the ladies, and shall be glad to help you decide on something, if I can," said the doctor seriously. "What do you incline to? A natural taste or talent is a great help in choosing, you know." "I haven't any talent, or any especial taste that I can see, and that is why I can't decide, uncle. So I think it would be a good plan to pick out some very useful business and learn it, because I don't do it for pleasure, you see, but as part of my education, and to be ready in case I am ever poor," answered Rose, looking as if she rather longed for a little poverty, so that her useful gift might be exercised. "Well now, there is one very excellent, necessary, and womanly accomplishment that no girl should be without, for it is a help to rich and poor, and the comfort of families depends upon it. This fine talent is neglected nowadays, and considered old-fashioned, which is a sad mistake, and one that I don't mean to make in bringing up my girl. It should be a part of every girl's education, and I know of a most accomplished lady who will teach you in the best and pleasantest manner." "Oh, what is it?" cried Rose eagerly, charmed to be met in this helpful and cordial way. "Housekeeping," answered Dr. Alec. "Is that an accomplishment?" asked Rose, while her face fell, for she had indulged in all sorts of vague, delightful dreams. "Yes, it is one of the most beautiful as well as useful of all the arts a woman can learn. Not so romantic, perhaps, as singing, painting, riding, or teaching, even, but one that makes many happy and comfortable, and home the sweetest place in the world. Yes, you may open your big eyes, but it is a fact that I had rather see you a good housekeeper than the greatest belle in the city. It need not interfere with any talent you may possess, but it is a necessary part of your training, and I hope that you will set about it at once, now that you are well and strong." "Who is the lady?" asked Rose, rather impressed by her uncle's earnest speech. "Aunt Plenty." "Is she accomplished?" began Rose in a wondering tone, for this great aunt of hers had seemed the least cultivated of them all. "In the good old-fashioned way she is very accomplished, and has made this house a happy home to us all, ever since we can remember. She is not elegant, but genuinely good, and so beloved and respected that there will be universal mourning for her when her place is empty. No one can fill it, for the solid, homely virtues of the dear soul have gone out of fashion, as I say, and nothing new can be half so satisfactory, to me at least." "I should like to have people feel so about me. Can she teach me to do what she does, and to grow as good?" asked Rose, with a little prick of remorse for even thinking that Aunt Plenty was a commonplace old lady. "Yes, if you don't despise such simple lessons as she can give. I know it would fill her dear old heart with pride and pleasure, to feel that any one cared to learn of her, for she fancies her day gone by. Let her teach you how to be what she has been, a skilful, frugal, cheerful housewife, the maker and the keeper of a happy home, and by, you will see what a valuable lesson it is." "I will, uncle, but how shall I begin?" "I'll speak to her about it, and she will make it all right with Dolly, for cooking is one of the main things, you know." "So it is. I don't mind that a bit, for I like to mess, and used to try at home, but I had no one to tell me, so I never did much but spoil my aprons. Pies are great fun, only Dolly is so cross I don't believe she will ever let me do a thing in the kitchen." "Then we'll cook in the parlor. I fancy Aunt Plenty will manage her, so don't be troubled. Only mind this, I'd rather you learned how to make good bread than the best pies ever baked. When you bring me a handsome, wholesome loaf, entirely made by yourself, I shall be more pleased than if you offered me a pair of slippers embroidered in the very latest style. I don't wish to bribe you, but I'll give you my heartiest kiss, and promise to eat every crumb of the loaf myself." "It's a bargain! It's a bargain! Come and tell auntie all about it, for I'm in a hurry to begin," cried Rose, dancing before him toward the parlor, where Miss Plenty sat alone knitting contentedly, yet ready to run at the first call for help of any sort, from any quarter. No need to tell how surprised and gratified she was at the invitation she received to teach the child the domestic arts which were her only accomplishments, nor to relate how energetically she set about her pleasant task. Dolly dared not grumble, for Miss Plenty was the one person whom she obeyed, and Phoebe openly rejoiced, for these new lessons brought Rose nearer to her, and glorified the kitchen in the good girl's eyes. To tell the truth, the elder aunts had sometimes felt that they did not have quite their share of the little niece who had won their hearts long ago, and was the sunshine of the house. They talked it over together sometimes, but always ended by saying that as Alec had all the responsibility, he should have the larger share of the dear girl's love and time, and they would be contented with such crumbs of comfort as they could get. Dr. Alec had found out this little secret, and, after reproaching himself for being blind and selfish, was trying to devise some way of mending matters without troubling any one, when Rose's new whim suggested an excellent method of weaning her a little from himself. He did not know how fond he was of her till he gave her up to the new teacher, and often could not resist peeping in at the door to see how she got on, or stealing sly looks through the slide when she was deep in dough, or listening intently to some impressive lecture from Aunt Plenty. They caught him at it, now and then, and ordered him off the premises at the point of the rolling pin, or, if unusually successful, and therefore in a milder mood, they lured him away with bribes of gingerbread, a stray pickle, or a tart that was not quite symmetrical enough to suit their critical eyes. Of course he made a point of partaking copiously of all the delectable messes that now appeared at the table, for both the cooks were on their mettle, and he fared sumptuously every day. But an especial relish was given to any dish when, in reply to his honest praise of it, Rose colored up with innocent pride, and said modestly, "I made that, uncle, and I'm glad you like it." It was some time before the perfect loaf appeared, for bread making is an art not easily learned, and Aunt Plenty was very thorough in her teaching, so Rose studied yeast first, and through various stages of cake and biscuit came at last to the crowning glory of the handsome wholesome loaf. It appeared at tea time on a silver salver, proudly borne in by Phoebe, who could not refrain from whispering, with a beaming face, as she set it down before Dr. Alec, "Ain't it just lovely, sir?" "It is a regularly splendid loaf. Did my girl make it all herself?" he asked, surveying the shapely, sweet-smelling object with real interest and pleasure. "Every particle herself, and never asked a bit of help or advice from any one," answered Aunt Plenty, folding her hands with an air of unmitigated satisfaction, for her pupil certainly did her great credit. "I've had so many failures and troubles that I really thought I never should be able to do it alone. Dolly let one splendid batch burn up because I forgot it. She was there and smelt it, but never did a thing, for she said when I undertook to bake bread I must give my whole mind to it. Wasn't it hard? She might have called me at least," said Rose, recollecting with a sigh the anguish of that moment. "She meant you should learn by experience, as Rosamund did in that little affair of the purple jar, you remember. I always thought it very unfair in her mother not to warn the poor thing a little bit, and she was regularly mean when Rosamund asked for a bowl to put the purple stuff in, and she said, in such a provoking way, 'I did not agree to lend you a bowl, but I will, my dear.' Ugh! I always want to shake that hateful woman, though she was a moral mamma." "Never mind her now, but tell me all about my loaf," said Dr. Alec, much amused at Rose's burst of indignation. "There's nothing to tell, uncle, except that I did my best, gave my mind to it, and sat watching over it, all the while it was in the oven, till I was quite baked myself. Everything went right this time, and it came out a nice, round, crusty loaf, as you see. Now taste it, and tell me if it is good as well as handsome." "Must I cut it? Can't I put it under a glass cover, and keep it in the parlor as they do wax flowers, and fine works of that sort?" "What an idea, uncle! It would mold and be spoilt. Besides, people would laugh at us, and make fun of my old-fashioned accomplishment. You promised to eat it, and you must, not all at once, but as soon as you can, so I can make you some more." Dr. Alex solemnly cut off his favorite crusty slice, and solemnly ate it, then wiped his lips, and, brushing back Rose's hair, solemnly kissed her on the forehead, saying heartily, "My dear, it is perfect bread, and you are an honor to your teacher. When we have our model school, I shall offer a prize for the best bread, and you will get it." "I've got it already, and I'm quite satisfied," said Rose, slipping into her seat and trying to hide her right hand, which had a burn on it. But Dr. Alex saw it, guessed how it came there, and after tea insisted on easing the pain which she would hardly confess. "Aunt Clara says I'm spoiling my hands, but I don't care, for I've had such good times with Aunt Plenty, and I think she has enjoyed it as much as I have. Only one thing troubles me, uncle, and I want to ask you about it," said Rose, as they paced up and down the hall in the twilight, the bandaged hand very carefully laid on Dr. Alec's arm. "More little confidences? I like them immensely, so tell away, my dear." "Well, you see, I feel as if Aunt Peace would like to do something for me, and I've found out what it can be. You know she can't go about like Auntie Plen, and we are so busy nowadays that she is rather lonely, I'm afraid. So I want to take lessons in sewing of her. She works so beautifully, and it is a useful thing, you know, and I ought to be a good needlewoman as well as a housekeeper, oughtn't I?" "Bless your kind little heart, that is what I was thinking the other day, when Aunt Peace said she saw you so very seldom now, you were so busy. I wanted to speak of it, but fancied you had as much on your hands as you could manage. It would delight the dear woman to teach you all her delicate handicraft, especially buttonholes, for I believe that is where young ladies fail. At least, I've heard them say so. So, do you devote your mind to buttonholes, make 'em all over my clothes if you want something to practice on. I'll wear any quantity." Rose laughed at this reckless offer, but promised to attend that important branch, though she confessed that darning was her weak point. Whereupon Uncle Alec engaged to supply her with socks in all stages of dilapidation, and to have a new set at once, so that she could run the heels for him as a pleasant beginning. Then they went up to make their request in due form, to the great delight of gentle Aunt Peace, who got quite excited with the fun that went on while they would yarn, looked up darning needles, and fitted out a nice little mending basket for her pupil. Very busy and very happy were Rose's days now, for in the morning she went about the house with Aunt Plenty, attending to linen closets and storerooms, pickling and preserving, exploring garret and cellar to see that all was right, and learning, in the good old-fashioned manner, to look well after the ways of the household. In the afternoon, after her walk or drive, she sat with Aunt Peace plying her needle, while Aunt Plenty, whose eyes were failing, knitted and chatted briskly, telling many a pleasant story of old times, till the three were moved to laugh and cry together, for the busy needles were embroidering all sorts of bright patterns on the lives of the workers, though they seemed to be only stitching cotton and darning hose. It was a pretty sight to see the rosy-faced little maid sitting between the two old ladies, listening dutifully to their instructions, and cheering the lessons with her lively chatter and blithe laugh. If the kitchen had provided attraction to Dr. Alec when Rose was there at work, the sewing-room was quite irresistible, and he made himself so agreeable that no one had the heart to drive him away, especially when he read aloud or spun yarns. "There, I've made you a new set of warm nightgowns, with 4 buttonholes in each. See if they are not neatly done," said Rose, one day, some weeks after the new lessons began. "Even to a thread, and nice little bars across the end, so I can't tear them when I twitch the buttons out. "Most superior work, ma'am, and I'm deeply grateful. So much so that I'll sew on these buttons myself, and save those tired fingers from another prick." "You sew them on?" cried Rose, with her eyes wide open in amazement. "Wait a bit till I get my sewing tackle, and then you shall see what I can do." "Can he really?" asked Rose of Aunt Peace, as Uncle Alec marched off with a comical air of importance. "Oh, yes, I taught him years ago, before he went out to sea, and I suppose he has had to do things for himself, more or less, ever since, so he has kept his hand in." He evidently had, for he was soon back with a funny little work bag, out of which he produced a thimble without a top, and, having threaded his needle, he proceeded to sew on the buttons so handily that Rose was much impressed and amused. "I wonder if there is anything in the world that you cannot do," she said, in a tone of respectful admiration. "There are one or two things that I am not up to yet," he answered, with a laugh in the corner of his eye, as he waxed his thread with a flourish. "I should like to know what." "Bread and buttonholes, ma'am." Chapter 17. Good Bargains. It was a rainy Sunday afternoon, and four boys were trying to spend it quietly in the "libery," as Jamie called the room devoted to books and boys, at Aunt Jessie's. Will and Geordie were sprawling on the sofa, deep in the adventures of the scapegraces and ragamuffins whose histories are now the fashion. Archie lounged in the easy chair, surrounded by newspapers. Charlie stood upon the rug, in an Englishman's favorite attitude, and, I regret to say, both were smoking cigars. "It is my opinion that this day will never come to an end," said Prince, with a yawn that nearly rent him asunder. "Read and improve your mind, my son," answered Archie, peering solemnly over the paper behind which he had been dozing. "Don't preach, parson, but put on your boots and come out for a tramp, instead of mulling over the fire like a granny." "No, thank you. Tramps in an easterly storm don't strike me as amusing." There Archie stopped and held up his hand, for a pleasant voice was heard saying outside, "Are the boys in the library, auntie?" "Yes, dear, and longing for sunshine, so run in and make it for them," answered Mrs. Jessie. "It's Rose," and Archie threw his cigar into the fire. "What's that for?" asked Charlie. "Gentlemen don't smoke before ladies." "True, but I'm not going to waste my weed," and Prince poked his into the empty inkstand that served them for an ash tray. A gentle tap at the door was answered by a chorus of "Come in," and Rose appeared, looking blooming and breezy with the chilly air. "If I disturb you, say so, and I'll go away," she began, pausing on the threshold with modest hesitation, for something in the elder boys' faces excited her curiosity. "You never disturb us, cousin," said the smokers, while the readers tore themselves from the heroes of the bar-room and gutter, long enough to nod affably to their guest. As Rose bent to warm her hands, one end of Archie's cigar stuck out of the ashes, smoking furiously and smelling strongly. "Oh, you bad boys, how could you do it, to-day, of all days?" she said reproachfully. "Where's the harm?" asked Archie. "You know as well as I do. Your mother doesn't like it, and it's a bad habit, for it wastes money and does you no good." "Fiddlesticks! Every man smokes, even Uncle Alec, whom you think so perfect," began Charlie, in his teasing way. "No, he doesn't. He has given it up, and I know why," cried Rose eagerly. "Now I think of it, I haven't seen the old meerschaum since he came home. Did he stop it on our account?" asked Archie. "Yes," and Rose told the little scene on the seashore in the camping out time. Archie seemed much impressed, and said manfully, "He won't have done that in vain so far as I'm concerned. I don't care a pin about smoking, so can give it up as easy as not, and I promise you I will. I only do it now and then for fun." "You too?" and Rose looked up at the bonny prince, who never looked less bonny at that moment, for he had resumed his cigar, just to torment her. Now Charlie cared as little as Archie about smoking, but it would not do to yield too soon. So he shook his head, gave a great puff, and said loftily, "You women are always asking us to give up harmless little things, just because you don't approve of them. How would you like it if we did the same by you, miss?" "If I did harmful or silly things, I'd thank you for telling me of them, and I'd try to mend my ways," answered Rose heartily. "Well, now, we'll see if you mean what you say. I'll give up smoking to please you, if you will give up something to please me," said Prince, seeing a good chance to lord it over the weaker vessel at small cost to himself. "I'll agree, if it is foolish as smoking cigars." "Oh, it's ever so much sillier." "Then I promise. What is it?" And Rose quite trembled with anxiety to know which of her pet habits or possessions she must lose. "Give up your earrings." And Charlie laughed wickedly, sure that she would never hold to that bargain. Rose uttered a cry, and clapped both hands to her ears, where the gold rings hung. "Oh, Charlie, wouldn't anything else do as well? I've been through so much teasing and trouble, I do want to enjoy my pretty earrings, for I can wear them now." "Wear as many as you like, and I'll smoke in peace," returned this bad boy. "Will nothing else satisfy you?" imploringly. "Nothing," sternly. Rose stood silent for a minute, thinking of something Aunt Jessie once said. "You have more influence over the boys than you know. Use it for their good, and I shall thank you all my life." Here was a chance to do some good by sacrificing a little vanity of her own. She felt it was right to do it, yet found it very hard, and asked wistfully, "Do you mean never wear them, Charlie?" "Never, unless you want me to smoke." "I never do." "Then clinch the bargain." He had no idea she would do it, and was much surprised when she took the dear rings from her ears, with a quick gesture, and held them out to him, saying, in a tone that made the color come up to his brown cheek, it was so full of sweet good will, "I care more for my cousins than for my earrings, so I promise, and I'll keep my word." "For shame, Prince! Let her wear her little danglers if she likes, and don't bargain about doing what you know is right," cried Archie, coming out of his grove of newspapers with an indignant bounce. But Rose was bent on showing her aunt that she could use her influence for the boys' good, and said steadily, "It is fair, and I want it to be so. Then you will believe I'm in earnest. Here, each of you wear one of these on your watch guard to remind you. I shall not forget, because very soon I cannot wear earrings if I want to." As she spoke, Rose offered a little ring to each cousin, and the boys, seeing how sincere she was, obeyed her. When the pledges were safe, Rose stretched a hand to each, and the lads gave hers a hearty grip, half pleased and half ashamed of their part in the compact. Just at that moment Dr. Alec and Mrs. Jessie came in. "What's this? Dancing ladies' triumph on Sunday?" exclaimed Uncle Alec, surveying the trio with surprise. "No, sir, it is the Anti-Tobacco League. Will you join?" said Charlie, while Rose slipped away to her aunt, and Archie buried both cigars behind the back log. When the mystery was explained, the elders were well pleased, and Rose received a vote of thanks, which made her feel as if she had done a service to her country, as she had, for every boy who grows up free from bad habits bids fair to make a good citizen. "I wish Rose would drive a bargain with Will and Geordie also, for I think these books are as bad for the small boys as cigars for the large ones," said Mrs. Jessie, sitting down on the sofa between the readers, who politely curled up their legs to make room for her. "I thought they were all the fashion," answered Dr. Alec, settling in the big chair with Rose. "So is smoking, but it is harmful. The writers of these popular stories intend to do good, I have no doubt, but it seems to me they fail because their motto is 'Be smart and you will be rich,' instead of 'Be honest and you will be happy.' I do not judge hastily, Alec, for I have read a dozen, at least, of these stories, and with much that is attractive to boys, I find a great deal to condemn in them, and other parents say the same when I ask them." "Now, Mum, that's too bad. I like 'em tip-top. This one is a regular screamer," cried Will. "They're bully books, and I'd like to know where's the harm," added Geordie. "You have just shown us one of the chief evils, and that is slang," answered their mother quickly. "Must have it, ma'am. If these chaps talked all right, there'd be no fun in 'em," protested Will. "A bootblack mustn't use good grammar, and a newsboy must swear a little, or he wouldn't be natural," explained Geordie, both boys ready to fight gallantly for their favorites. "But my sons are neither bootblacks nor newsboys, and I object to hearing them use such words as screamer, bully, and buster. In fact, I fail to see the advantage of writing books about such people unless it is done in a very different way. I cannot think they will help to refine the ragamuffins if they read them, and I'm sure they can do no good to the better class of boys who, through these books, are introduced to police courts, counterfeiters' dens, gambling houses, drinking saloons, and all sorts of low life. Some of them are about first-rate boys, mother, and they go to sea and study, and sail around the world, having great larks all the way. I have read about them, Geordie, and though they are better than the others, I am not satisfied with these optical delusions, as I call them. Now, I put it to you, boys, is it natural for lads from 15 to 18 to command ships, defeat pirates, outwit smugglers, and so cover themselves with glory that Admiral Farragut invites them to dinner, saying, 'Noble boy, you are an honor to your country'? Or, if the hero is in the army, he has hairbreadth escapes and adventures enough in one small volume to turn his hair white, and in the end he goes to Washington at the express desire of the President or Commander-in-Chief, to be promoted to no end of stars and bars. Even if the hero is merely an honest boy trying to get his living, he is not permitted to do so in a natural way, by hard work and years of patient effort, but is suddenly adopted by a millionaire whose pocket-book he has returned. Or a rich uncle appears from sea just in the nick of time. Or the remarkable boy earns a few dollars, speculates in peanuts or neckties, and grows rich so rapidly that Sinbad in the Diamond Valley is a pauper compared to him. Isn't it so, boys?" "Well, the fellows in these books are mighty lucky, and very smart, I must say," answered Will, surveying an illustration on the open page before him, where a small but virtuous youth is upsetting a tipsy giant in a bar-room, and under it the elegant inscription, "Dick Dauntless punches the head of Sam Soaker." "It gives boys such wrong ideas of life and business, shows them so much evil and vulgarity that they need not know about, and makes the one success worth having a fortune, a lord's daughter, or some worldly honor, often not worth the time it takes to win. It does seem to me that some one might write stories that should be lively, natural, and helpful tales, in which the English should be good, the morals pure, and the characters such as we can love in spite of the faults that all may have. I can't bear to see such crowds of eager little fellows at the libraries reading such trash. Weak when it is not wicked, and totally unfit to feed the hungry minds that feast on it for want of something better. There, my lecture is done, and now I should like to hear what you gentlemen have to say." And Aunt Jessie subsided with a pretty flush on the face that was full of motherly anxiety for her boys. "Tom Brown just suits mother, and me too. I wish Mr. Hughes would write another story as good," said Archie. "You don't find things of this sort in Tom Brown, yet these books are all in the Sunday school libraries," and Mrs. Jessie read the following paragraph from the book she had taken from Will's hand. "In this place we saw a tooth of John the Baptist. Ben said he could see locust and wild honey sticking to it. I couldn't. Perhaps John used a piece of the true cross for a toothpick." "A larky sort of boy says that, mum, and we skip the parts where they describe what they saw in the different countries," cried Will. "And those descriptions, taken mostly from guide-books, I fancy, are the only parts of any real worth. The scrapes of the bad boys make up the rest of the story, and it is for those you read those books, I think," answered his mother, stroking back the hair off the honest little face that looked rather abashed at this true statement of the case. "Anyway, mother, the ship part is useful, for we learn how to sail her, and by that will all come handy when we go to sea," put in Geordie. "Indeed! Then you can explain this maneuver to me, of course," and Mrs. Jessie read from another page the following nautical paragraph: "The wind is south-southwest, and we can have her up 4 points closer to the wind, and still be 6 points off the wind. As she luffs up we shall man the fore and main sheets, slack on the weather, and haul on the lee braces." "I guess I could, if I wasn't afraid of uncle. He knows so much more than I do, he'd laugh," began Geordie, evidently puzzled by the question. "Ho, you know you can't, so why make believe? We don't understand half of the sea lingo, Mum, and I dare say it's all wrong," cried Will, suddenly going over to the enemy, to Geordie's great disgust. "I do wish the boys wouldn't talk to me as if I was a ship," said Rose, bringing forward a private grievance. "Coming home from church this morning, the wind blew me about, and Will called out, right in the street, 'Brail up the foresail, and take in the flying jib. That will ease her.'" The boys shouted at the plaintive tone in which Rose repeated the words that offended her, and Will vainly endeavored to explain that he only meant to tell her to wrap her cloak closer, and tie a veil over the tempest-tossed feathers in her hat. To tell the truth, if the boys must have slang, I can bear the sea lingo, as Will calls it, better than the other. It afflicts me less to hear my sons talk about brailing up the foresail than doing as they darn please, and cut your cable is decidedly preferable to let her rip. I once made a rule that I would have no slang in the house. I give it up now, for I cannot keep it, but I will not have rubbishy books. So, Archie, please send these two after your cigars." Mrs. Jessie held both the small boys fast, with an arm round each neck, and when she took this base advantage of them, they could only squirm with dismay. "Yes, right behind the back log," she continued, energetically. "There, my hearties. You like sea slang, so I'll give you a bit. Now, I want you to promise not to read any more stuff for a month, and I'll agree to supply you with wholesome fare." "Oh, mother, not a single one!" cried Will. "Couldn't we just finish those?" pleaded Geordie. "The boys threw away half-smoked cigars, and your books must go after them. Surely you would not be outdone by the old fellows, as you call them, or be less obedient to little Mum than they were to Rose." "Course not. Come on, Geordie," and Will took the vow like a hero. His brother sighed and obeyed, but privately resolved to finish his story the minute the month was over. "You have laid out a hard task for yourself, Jessie, in trying to provide good readings for boys who have been living on sensation stories. It will be like going from raspberry tarts to plain bread and butter, but you will probably save them from a bilious fever," said Dr. Alec, much amused at the proceedings. "I remember hearing Grandpa say that a love for good books was one of the best safeguards a man could have," began Archie, staring thoughtfully at the fine library before him. "Yes, but there's no time to read nowadays. A fellow has to keep scratching round to make money, or he's nobody," cut in Charlie, trying to look worldly wise. "This love of money is the curse of America, and for the sake of it men will sell honor and honesty till we don't know whom to trust, and it is only a genius like Agassiz who dares to say, 'I cannot waste my time in getting rich,'" said Mrs. Jessie sadly. "Do you want us to be poor, mother?" asked Archie, wondering. "No, dear, and you never need be while you can use your hands, but I am afraid of this thirst for wealth, and the temptations it brings. Oh, my boys, I tremble for the time when I must let you go, because I think it would break my heart to have you fail as so many fail. It would be far easier to see you dead, if it could be said of you as of Sumner, 'No man dared offer him a bribe.'" Mrs. Jessie was so earnest in her motherly anxiety that her voice faltered over the last words, and she hugged the yellow heads closer in her arms, as if she feared to let them leave that safe harbor for the great sea where so many little boats go down. The younger lads nestled closer to her, and Archie said, in his quiet, resolute way, "I cannot promise to be an Agassiz or a Sumner, mother, but I do promise to be an honest man, please God." "Then I'm satisfied," and holding fast the hand he gave her, she sealed his promise with a kiss, that had all a mother's hope and faith in it. "I don't see how they ever can be bad, she is so fond and proud of them," whispered Rose, quite touched by the little scene. "You must help her make them what they should be. You have begun already, and when I see those rings where they are, my girl is prettier in my sight than if the biggest diamonds that ever twinkled shone in her ears," answered Dr. Alec, looking at her with approving eyes. "I'm so glad you think I can do anything, for I perfectly ache to be useful. Every one is so good to me, especially Aunt Jessie." "I think you are in a fair way to pay your debts, Rosie, for when girls give up their little vanities, and boys their small vices, and try to strengthen each other in well-doing, matters are going as they ought. Work away, my dear, and help their mother keep these sons fit friends for an innocent creature like yourself. They will be the manlier men for it, I can assure you."
Chapter 18. Fashion and Physiology. "Please, sir, I'd guess you'd better step right away, or it will be too late, for I heard Miss Rose say she knew you wouldn't like it, and she'd never dare to let you see her." Phoebe said this as she popped her head into the study, where Dr. Alec sat reading a new book. "They are at it, are they?" he said, looking up quickly, and giving himself a shake, as if ready for a battle of some sort. "Yes, sir, as hard as they can talk, and Miss Rose don't seem to know what to do, for the things are ever so stylish, and she looks elegant in 'em, though I like her best in the old ones," answered Phoebe. "You are a girl of sense. I'll settle matters for Rosie, and you'll lend a hand. Is everything ready in her room, and are you sure you understand how they go?" "Oh, yes, sir, but they are so funny. I know Miss Rose will think it's a joke," and Phoebe laughed, as if something tickled her immensely. "Never mind what she thinks, so long as she obeys. Tell her to do it for my sake, and she will find it the best joke she ever saw." "I expect to have a tough time of it, but we'll win yet," said the doctor, as he marched upstairs with the book in his hand, and an odd smile on his face. There was such a clatter of tongues in the sewing room that no one heard his tap at the door, so he pushed it open and took an observation. Aunt Plenty, Aunt Clara, and Aunt Jessie were all absorbed in gazing at Rose, who slowly revolved between them and the great mirror in a full winter costume of the latest fashion. "Bless my heart! Worse even than I expected," thought the doctor, with an inward groan, for, to his benighted eyes, the girl looked like a trussed fowl, and the fine new dress had neither grace, beauty, nor fitness to recommend it. The suit was of two peculiar shades of blue, so arranged that patches of light and dark distracted the eye. The upper skirt was tied so tightly back that it was impossible to take a long step, and the under one was so loaded with plaited frills that it wobbled, no other word will express it, ungracefully both fore and aft. A bunch of folds was gathered up just below the waist behind, and a great bow rode atop. A small jacket, of the same material, was adorned with a high ruff at the back, and laid well open over the breast to display some lace and a locket. Heavy fringes, bows, puffs, ruffles, and revers finished off the dress, making one's head ache to think of the amount of work wasted, for not a single graceful line struck the eye, and the beauty of the material was quite lost in the profusion of ornament. A high velvet hat, audaciously turned up in front, with a bunch of pink roses and a sweeping plume, was cocked over one ear, and, with her curls braided into a club at the back of her neck, Rose's head looked more like that of a dashing young cavalier than a modest little girl's. High-heeled boots tilted her well forward, a tiny muff pinioned her arms, and a spotted veil, tied so closely over her face that her eyelashes were rumpled by it, gave the last touch of absurdity to her appearance. "Now she looks like other girls, and as I like to see her," Mrs. Clara was saying, with an air of great satisfaction. "She does look like a fashionable young lady, but somehow I miss my little Rose, for children dressed like children in my day," answered Aunt Plenty, peering through her glasses with a troubled look, for she could not imagine the creature before her ever sitting in her lap, running to wait upon her, or making the house gay with a child's blithe presence. "Things have changed since your day, Aunt, and it takes time to get used to new ways. But you, Jessie, surely like this costume better than the dowdy things Rose has been wearing all summer." "Now be honest, and own you do," said Mrs. Clara, bent on being praised for her work. "Well, dear, to be quite honest, then, I think it is frightful," answered Mrs. Jessie, with a candor that caused Revolving Rose to stop in dismay. "Hear, hear!" cried a deep voice, and with a general start the ladies became aware that the enemy was among them. Rose blushed up to her hat brim, and stood, looking as she felt, like a fool, while Mrs. Clara hastened to explain. "Of course I don't expect you to like it, Alec, but I don't consider you a judge of what is proper and becoming for a young lady. Therefore I have taken the liberty of providing a pretty street suit for Rose. She need not wear it if you object, for I know we promised to let you do what you liked with the poor dear for a year." "It is a street costume, is it?" asked the doctor, mildly. "Do you know, I never should have guessed that it was meant for winter weather and brisk locomotion. Take a turn, Rosie, and let me see all its beauties and advantages." Rose tried to walk off with her usual free tread, but the underskirt got in her way, the overskirt was so tight she could not take a long step, and her boots made it impossible to carry herself perfectly erect. "I haven't got used to it yet," she said petulantly, kicking at her train, as she turned to toddle back again. "Suppose a mad dog or a runaway horse was after you. Could you get out of the way without upsetting, Colonel?" asked the doctor with a twinkle in the eyes that were fixed on the rakish hat. "Don't think I could, but I'll try," and Rose made a rush across the room. Her boot heels caught on a rug, several strings broke, her hat tipped over her eyes, and she plunged promiscuously into a chair, where she sat laughing so infectiously that all but Mrs. Clara joined in her mirth. I should say that a walking suit in which one could not walk, and a winter suit which exposes the throat, head, and feet to cold and damp, was rather a failure, Clara, especially as it has no beauty to reconcile one to its utter unfitness," said Dr. Alec, as he helped Rose undo her veil, adding, in a low tone, "Nice thing for the eyes. You'll soon see spots when it's off as well as when it's on, and by, be a case for an oculist." "No beauty!" cried Mrs. Clara warmly. "Now that's just a man's blindness. This is the best of silk and camel's hair, real ostrich feathers, and an expensive ermine muff. What could be in better taste, or more proper for a young girl?" "I'll shoe you, if Rose will go to her room and oblige me by putting on what she finds there," answered the doctor, with unexpected readiness. "Alec, if it is a bloomer, I shall protest. I've been expecting it, but I know I cannot bear to see that pretty child sacrificed to your wild ideas of health. Tell me it isn't a bloomer," and Mrs. Clara clasped her hands imploringly. "It is not." "Thank heaven!" and she resigned herself with a sigh of relief, adding plaintively, "I did hope you'd accept my suit, for poor Rose has been afflicted with frightful clothes, long enough to spoil the taste of any girl." "You talk of my afflicting the child, and then make a helpless guy like that of her," answered the doctor, pointing to the little fashion plate that was scuttling out of sight as fast as it could go. He closed the door with a shrug, but before anyone could speak, his quick eye fell upon an object which caused him to frown and demand in an indignant tone, "After all I have said, were you really going to tempt my girl with those abominable things?" "I thought we put them away when she wouldn't wear them," murmured Mrs. Clara, whisking a little pair of corsets out of sight with guilty haste. "I only brought them to try, for Rose is growing stout, and will have no figure if it is not attended to soon," she added, with an air of calm conviction that roused the doctor still more, for this was one of his special abominations. "Growing stout! Yes, thank heaven she is, and shall continue to do it, for nature knows how to mold a woman better than any corset maker, and I won't have her interfered with. My dear Clara, have you lost your senses that you can for a moment dream of putting a growing girl into an instrument of torture like this?" And with a sudden gesture he plucked forth the offending corsets from under the sofa cushion, and held them out with the expression one would wear on beholding the thumbscrews or the rack of ancient times. "Don't be absurd, Alec. There is no torture about it, for tight lacing is out of fashion, and we have nice, sensible things nowadays. Everyone wears them; even babies have stiffened waists to support their weak little backs," began Mrs. Clara, rushing to the defense of the pet delusion of most women. "I know it, and so the poor little souls have weak backs all their days, as their mothers had before them. It is vain to argue the matter, and I won't try, but I wish to state, once for all, that if I ever see a pair of corsets near Rose, I'll put them in the fire, and you may send the bill to me." As he spoke, the corsets were on their way to destruction, but Mrs. Jessie caught his arm, exclaiming merrily, "Don't burn them, for mercy's sake, Alec. They are full of whalebones, and will make a dreadful odor. Give them to me. I'll see that they do no harm." Whalebones indeed! A regular fence of them, and metal gate posts in front. As if our own bones were not enough if we'd give them a chance to do their duty, growled the doctor, yielding up the bone of contention with a last shake of contempt. Then his face cleared suddenly, and he held up his finger, saying, with a smile, "Hear those girls laugh. Cramped lungs could not make hearty music like that." Peals of laughter issued from Rose's room, and smiles involuntarily touched the lips of those who listened to the happy sound. "Some new prank of yours, Alec?" asked Aunt Plenty indulgently, for she had come to believe in most of her nephew's odd notions, because they seemed to work so well. "Yes, ma'am, my last, and I hope you will like it. I discovered what Clara was at, and got my rival suit ready for to day. I am not going to afflict Rose, but let her choose, and if I'm not entirely mistaken, she will like my rig best. While we wait, I'll explain, and then you will appreciate the general effect better. I got hold of this little book, and was struck with its good sense and good taste, for it suggests a way to clothe women both healthfully and handsomely, and that is a great point. It begins at the foundations, as you will see if you will look at these pictures, and I should think women would rejoice at this lightening of their burdens." As he spoke, the doctor laid the book before Aunt Plenty, who obediently brought her spectacles to bear upon the illustrations, and after a long look, exclaimed, with a scandalized face, "Mercy on us! These things are like the night drawers Jamie wears. You don't mean to say you want Rose to come out in this costume? It's not proper, and I won't consent to it." "I do mean it, and I'm sure my sensible aunt will consent, when she understands that these, well, I'll call them by an Indian name, and say pajamas, are for underwear, and Rose can have as pretty frocks as she likes outside. These 2 suits of flannel, each in one piece from head to foot, with a skirt or so hung on this easily fitting waist, will keep the child warm without burdening her with belts, and gathers, and buckles, and bunches round the waist, and leave free the muscles that need plenty of room to work in. She shall never have the backache if I can help it, nor the long list of ills you dear women think you cannot escape." "I don't consider it modest, and I'm sure Rose will be shocked at it," began Mrs. Clara, but stopped suddenly, as Rose appeared in the doorway, not looking shocked a bit. "Come on, my hygienic model, and let us see you," said her uncle, with an approving glance as she walked in, looking so mischievously merry that it was evident she enjoyed the joke. "Well, I don't see anything remarkable. That is a neat, plain suit. The materials are good, and it's not unbecoming, if you want her to look like a little schoolgirl, but it has not a particle of style, and no one would ever give it a second glance," said Mrs. Clara, feeling that her last remark condemned the whole thing. "Exactly what I want," answered the provoking doctor, rubbing his hands with a satisfied air. "Rosie looks now like what she is, a modest little girl, who does not want to be stared at. I think she would get a glance of approval, though, from people who like sense and simplicity better than fuss and feathers. Revolve, my Hebe, and let me refresh my eyes by the sight of you." There was very little to see, however, only a pretty Gabrielle dress of a soft warm shade of brown, coming to the tops of a trim pair of boots with low heels. A sealskin sack, cap, and mittens, with a glimpse of scarlet at the throat, and the pretty curls tied up with a bright velvet of the same color, completed the external adornment, making her look like a robin redbreast, wintry yet warm. "How do you like it, Rosie?" asked the doctor, feeling that her opinion was more important to the success of his new idea than that of all the ants on the hill. "I feel very odd and light, but I'm warm as toast, and nothing seems to be in my way," answered Rose, with a skip which displayed shapely gaiters on legs that now might be free and active as a boy's under the modest skirts of a girl. "You can run away from the mad dogs, and walk off at a smart pace without tumbling on your nose now, I fancy." "Yes, uncle. Suppose the dog coming, I just hop over a wall, and so, when I walk of a cold day, I go like this." Entering fully into the spirit of the thing, Rose swung herself over the high back of the sofa as easily as one of her cousins, and then went down the long hall as if her stout boots were related to the famous 7 Leaguers. "There, you see how it will be. Dress her in that boyish way, and she will act like a boy. I do hate all these inventions of strong-minded women," exclaimed Mrs. Clara, as Rose came back at a run. "Ah, but you see some of these sensible inventions come from the brain of a fashionable modiste, who will make you more lovely, or what you value, more stylish, outside, and comfortable within. Mrs. Van Tassel has been to Madame Stone, and is wearing a full suit of this sort. Van himself told me, when I asked how she was, that she had given up lying on the sofa, and was going about in a most astonishing way, considering her feeble health." "You don't say so! Let me see that book a moment," and Aunt Clara examined the new patterns with a more respectful air, for if the elegant Mrs. Van Tassel wore these dreadful things, it would never do to be left behind, in spite of her prejudices. Dr. Alec looked at Mrs. Jessie, and both smiled, for little Mum had been in the secret, and enjoyed it mightily. "I thought that would settle it," he said with a nod. "I didn't wait for Mrs. Van to lead the way, and for once in my life I have adopted a new fashion before Clara. My freedom suit is ordered, and you may see me playing tag with Rose and the boys before long," answered Mrs. Jessie, nodding back at him. Meantime Aunt Plenty was examining Rose's costume, for the hat and sack were off, and the girl was eagerly explaining the new undergarments. "See, auntie, all nice scarlet flannel, and a gay little petticoat, and long stockings, oh, so warm. Phoebe and I nearly died laughing when I put this rig on, but I like it ever so much. The dress is so comfortable, and doesn't need any belt or sash, and I can sit without rumpling any trimming, that's such a comfort. I like to be tidy, and so, when I wear fussed-up things, I'm thinking of my clothes all the time, and that's tiresome. Do say you like it. I resolved I would, just to please uncle, for he does know more about health than any one else, I'm sure, and I'd wear a bag if he asked me to do it." "I don't ask that, Rose, but I wish you'd weigh and compare the 2 suits, and then choose which seems best. I leave it to your own common sense," answered Dr. Alec, feeling pretty sure he had won. "Why, I take this one, of course, uncle. The other is fashionable, and yes, I must say I think it's pretty, but it's very heavy, and I should have to go round like a walking doll if I wore it. I'm much obliged to auntie, but I'll keep this, please." Rose spoke gently but decidedly, though there was a look of regret when her eye fell on the other suit which Phoebe had brought in, and it was very natural to like to look as other girls did. Aunt Clara sighed. Uncle Alec smiled, and said heartily, "Thank you, dear. Now read this book, and you will understand why I ask it of you. Then, if you like, I'll give you a new lesson. You asked for one yesterday, and this is more necessary than French or housekeeping." "Oh, what?" and Rose caught up the book, which Mrs. Clara had thrown down with a disgusted look. Though Dr. Alec was 40, the boyish love of teasing was not yet dead in him, and, being much elated at his victory, he could not resist the temptation of shocking Mrs. Clara by suggesting dreadful possibilities, so he answered, half in earnest, half in jest, "Physiology, Rose. Wouldn't you like to be a little medical student, with Uncle Doctor for teacher, and be ready to take up his practice when he has to stop? If you agree, I'll hunt up my old skeleton to-morrow." That was too much for Aunt Clara, and she hastily departed, with her mind in a sad state of perturbation about Mrs. Van Tassel's new costume and Rose's new study. Chapter 19. Brother Bones. Rose accepted her uncle's offer, as Aunt Myra discovered 2 or 3 days later. Coming in for an early call, and hearing voices in the study, she opened the door, gave a cry, and shut it quickly, looking a good deal startled. The doctor appeared in a moment, and begged to know what the matter was. "How can you ask when that long box looked so like a coffin I thought it was one, and that dreadful thing stared me in the face as I opened the door," answered Mrs. Myra, pointing to the skeleton that hung from the chandelier, cheerfully grinning at all beholders. "This is a medical college where women are freely admitted, so walk in, madam, and join the class, if you'll do me the honor," said the doctor, waving her forward with his politest bow. "Do, auntie. It's perfectly splendid," cried Rose's voice, and Rose's blooming face was seen behind the ribs of the skeleton, smiling and nodding in the gayest possible manner. "What are you doing, child?" demanded Aunt Myra, dropping into a chair and staring about her. "Oh, I'm learning bones to day, and I like it so much. There are 12 ribs, you know, and the 2 lower ones are called floating ribs, because they are not fastened to the breastbone. That's why they go in so easily, if you lace tight, and squeeze the lungs and heart in the, let me see, what was that big word? Oh, I know, thoracic cavity." And Rose beamed with pride as she aired her little bit of knowledge. "Do you think that is a good sort of thing for her to be poking over? She is a nervous child, and I'm afraid it will be bad for her," said Aunt Myra, watching Rose as she counted vertebrae, and waggled a hip joint in its socket with an inquiring expression. "An excellent study, for she enjoys it, and I mean to teach her how to manage her nerves so that they won't be a curse to her, as many a woman's become through ignorance or want of thought. To make a mystery or terror of these things is a mistake, and I mean Rose shall understand and respect her body so well that she won't dare to trifle with it as most women do." "And she really likes it?" "Very much, auntie. It's all so wonderful and so nicely planned, you can hardly believe what you see. Just think, there are 600,000,000 air cells in one pair of lungs, and 2,000 pores to a square inch of surface. So you see what quantities of air we must have, and what care we should take of our skin, so all the little doors will open and shut right. And brains, auntie, you've no idea how curious they are. I haven't got to them yet, but I long to, and uncle is going to show me a manikin that you can take to pieces. Just think how nice it will be to see all the organs in their places. I only wish they could be made to work as ours do." It was funny to see Aunt Myra's face as Rose stood before her talking rapidly, with one hand laid in the friendliest manner on the skeleton's shoulder. Every word both the doctor and Rose uttered hit the good lady in her weakest spot, and as she looked and listened a long array of bottles and pill boxes rose up before her, reproaching her with the ignorance and want of thought that made her what she was, a nervous, dyspeptic, unhappy old woman. "Well, I don't know but you may be right, Alec, only I wouldn't carry it too far. Women don't need much of this sort of knowledge, and are not fit for it. I couldn't bear to touch that ugly thing, and it gives me the creeps to hear about organs," said Aunt Myra, with a sigh and her hand on her side. "Wouldn't it be a comfort to know that your liver was on the right side, auntie, and not on the left?" asked Rose, with a naughty laugh in her eyes, for she had lately learnt that Aunt Myra's liver complaint was not in the proper place. "It's a dying world, child, and it don't much matter where the pain is, for sooner or later we all drop off and are seen no more," was Aunt Myra's cheerful reply. "Well, I intend to know what kills me if I can, and meantime I'm going to enjoy myself in spite of a dying world. I wish you'd do so too, and come and study with uncle. It would do you good, I'm sure," and Rose went back to counting vertebrae with such a happy face that Aunt Myra had not the heart to say a word to dampen her ardor. "Perhaps it's as well to let her do what she likes the little while she is with us. But pray be careful of her, Alec, and not allow her to overwork," she whispered as she went out. "That's exactly what I'm trying to do, ma'am, and rather a hard job I find it," he added as he shut the door, for the dear aunts were dreadfully in his way sometimes. Half an hour later came another interruption in the shape of Mac, who announced his arrival by the brief but elegant remark, "Hello, what new game is this?" Rose explained. Mac gave a long whistle of surprise, and then took a promenade round the skeleton, observing gravely, "Brother Bones look very jolly, but I can't say much for his beauty." "You mustn't make fun of him, for he's a good old fellow, and you'd be just as ugly if your flesh was off," said Rose, defending her new friend with warmth. "I dare say, so I'll keep my flesh on, thank you. You are so busy you can't read to a fellow, I suppose?" asked Mac, whose eyes were better, but still too weak for books. "Don't you want to come and join my class? Uncle explains it all to us, and you can take a look at the plates as they come along. We'll give up bones today and have eyes instead. That will be more interesting to you," added Rose, seeing no ardent thirst for physiological information in his face. "Rose, we must not fly about from one thing to another in this way," began Dr. Alec, but she whispered quickly, with a nod towards Mac, whose goggles were turned wistfully in the direction of the forbidden books. "He's blue to-day, and we must amuse him. Give a little lecture on eyes, and it will do him good. No matter about me, uncle." "Very well, the class will please be seated," and the doctor gave a sounding rap on the table. "Come sit by me, dear, then we can both see the pictures, and if your head gets tired you can lie down," said Rose, generously opening her little college to a brother, and kindly providing for the weaknesses that all humanity is subject to. Side by side they sat and listened to a very simple explanation of the mechanism of the eye, finding it as wonderful as a fairy tale, for fine plates illustrated it, and a very willing teacher did his best to make the lesson pleasant. "Jove! If I'd known what mischief I was doing to that mighty delicate machine of mine, you wouldn't have caught me reading by firelight, or studying with a glare of sunshine on my book," said Mac, peering solemnly at a magnified eyeball. Then, pushing it away, he added indignantly, "Why isn't a fellow taught all about his works, and how to manage 'em, and not left to go blundering into all sorts of worries? Telling him after he's down isn't much use, for then he's found it out himself and won't thank you." "Ah, Mac, that's just what I keep lecturing about, and people won't listen. You lads need that sort of knowledge so much, and fathers and mothers ought to be able to give it to you. Few of them are able, and so we all go blundering, as you say. Less Greek and Latin, and more knowledge of the laws of health for my boys, if I had them. Mathematics are all very well, but morals are better, and I wish, how I wish that I could help teachers and parents to feel it as they ought." "Some do. Aunt Jessie and her boys have capital talks, and I wish we could, but mother's so busy with her housekeeping, and father with his business, there never seems to be any time for that sort of thing. Even if there was, it don't seem as if it would be easy to talk to them, because we've never got into the way of it, you know." Poor Mac was right there, and expressed a want that many a boy and girl feels. Fathers and mothers are too absorbed in business and housekeeping to study their children, and cherish that sweet and natural confidence which is a child's surest safeguard, and a parent's subtlest power. So the young hearts hide trouble or temptation till the harm is done, and mutual regret comes too late. Happy the boys and girls who tell all things freely to father or mother, sure of pity, help, and pardon, and thrice happy the parents who, out of their own experience and by their own virtues, can teach and uplift the souls for which they are responsible. This longing stirred in the hearts of Rose and Mac, and by a natural impulse both turned to Dr. Alec, for in this queer world of ours, fatherly and motherly hearts often beat warm and wise in the breasts of bachelor uncles and maiden aunts, and it is my private opinion that these worthy creatures are a beautiful provision of nature for the cherishing of other people's children. They certainly get great comfort out of it, and receive much innocent affection that otherwise would be lost. Dr. Alec was one of these, and his big heart had room for every one of the 8 cousins, especially orphaned Rose and afflicted Mac. So, when the boy uttered that unconscious reproach to his parents, and Rose added with a sigh, "It must be beautiful to have a mother," the good doctor yearned over them, and, shutting his book with a dedicated slam, said, in that cordial voice of his. "Now, look here, children, you just come and tell me all your worries, and with God's help I'll settle them for you. That is what I'm here for, I believe, and it will be a great happiness to me if you can trust me." "We can, uncle, and we will," both answered, with a heartiness that gratified him much. "Good. Now school is dismissed, and I advise you to go and refresh your 600,000,000 air cells by a brisk run in the garden. Come again whenever you like, Mac, and we'll teach you all we can about your works, as you call them, so you can keep them running smoothly." "Will come, sir. Much obliged," and the class in physiology went out to walk. Mac did come again, glad to find something he could study in spite of his weak eyes, and learned much that was of more value than anything his school had ever taught him. Of course, the other lads made great fun of the whole thing, and plagued Dr. Alec's students half out of their lives, but they kept on persistently, and one day something happened which made the other fellows behave themselves forever after. It was a holiday, and Rose, up in her room, thought she heard the voices of her cousins, so she ran down to welcome them, but found no one there. "Never mind, they will be here soon, and then we'll have a frolic," she said to herself, and, thinking she had been mistaken, she went into the study to wait. She was lounging over the table, looking at a map, when an odd noise caught her ear. A gentle tapping somewhere, and, following the sound, it seemed to come from the inside of the long case in which the skeleton lived when not professionally engaged. This case stood upright in a niche, between two bookcases at the back of the room, a darkish corner where Brother Bones, as the boys would call him, was out of the way. As Rose stood looking in that direction, and wondering if a rat had got shut in, the door of the case swung slowly open, and with a great start she saw a bony arm lifted, and a bony finger beckon to her. For a minute she was frightened, and ran to the study door with a fluttering heart, but just as she touched the handle a queer, stifled sort of giggle made her stop short and turn red with anger. She paused an instant to collect herself, and then went softly towards the bony beckoner. A nearer look revealed black threads tied to the arm and fingers, the ends of threads disappearing through holes bored in the back of the case. Peeping into the dark recess, she also caught sight of the tip of an elbow covered with a rough gray cloth, which she knew very well. Quick as a flash she understood the joke. Her fear vanished, and with a wicked smile she whipped out her scissors, cut the threads, and the bony arm dropped with a rattle. Before she could say, "Come out, Charlie, and let my skeleton alone," a sudden eruption of boys, all in a high state of tickle, proclaimed to the hidden rogue that his joke was a failure. "I told him not to do it, because it might give you a start," explained Archie, emerging from the closet. "I had a smelling bottle all ready if she fainted away," added Steve, popping up from behind the great chair. "It's too bad of you not to squawk and run. We depended on it. It's such fun to howl after you," said Will and Geordie, rolling out from under the sofa in a promiscuous heap. "You're getting altogether too strong-minded, Rose. Most girls would have been in a jolly twitter to see this old fellow waggling his finger at them," complained Charlie, squeezing out from his tight quarters, dusty and disgusted. "I'm used to your pranks now, so I'm always on the watch and prepared. But I won't have Brother Bones made fun of. I know Uncle wouldn't like it, so please don't," began Rose, just as Dr. Alec came in, and, seeing the state of the case at a glance, he said quietly, "Hear how I got that skeleton, and then I'm sure you will treat it with respect." The boy settled down at once on any article of furniture that was nearest, and listened dutifully. "Years ago, when I was in the hospital, a poor fellow was brought there with a rare and very painful disease. There was no hope for him, but we did our best, and he was so grateful that when he died he left us his body that we might discover the mysteries of his complaint, and so be able to help others afflicted in the same way. It did do good, and his brave patience made us remember him long after he was gone. He thought I had been kind to him, and said to a fellow student of mine, Tell the doctor I lave him my bones, for I've nothing else in the wide world, and I'll nos be wanting 'em at all, when the great pain hat kilt me entirely. So that is how they came to be mine, and why I've kept them carefully, for, though only a poor ignorant fellow, Mike Nolan did what he could to help others, and prove his gratitude to those who tried to help him." As Dr. Alec paused, Archie closed the door of the case as respectfully as if the mummy of an Egyptian king was inside. Will and Geordie looked solemnly at one another, evidently much impressed, and Charlie pensively remarked from the coal-hod where he sat, "I've often heard of a skeleton in the house, but I think few people have one as useful and as interesting as ours." Chapter 20. Under the Mistletoe. Rose made Phoebe promise that she would bring her stocking into the bower, as she called her pretty room, on Christmas morning, because that first delicious rummage loses half its charm if two little nightcaps at least do not meet over the treasures, and two happy voices oh and ah together. So when Rose opened her eyes that day, they fell upon faithful Phoebe, rolled up in a shawl, sitting on the rug before a blazing fire, with her untouched stocking laid beside her. "Merry Christmas!" cried the little mistress, smiling gaily. "Merry Christmas!" answered the little maid, so heartily that it did one good to hear her. "Bring the stockings right away, Phoebe, and let's see what we've got," said Rose, sitting up among the pillows, and looking as eager as a child. A pair of long knobby hose were laid out upon the coverlet, and their contents examined with delight, though each knew every blessed thing that had been put into the other stocking. Never mind what they were, it is evident that they were quite satisfactory, for as Rose leaned back, she said, with a luxurious sigh of satisfaction, "Now I believe I've got everything in the world that I want." And Phoebe answered, smiling over a lapful of treasures, "This is the most splendid Christmas I ever had since I was born." Then she added with an important air, "Do wish for something else, because I happen to know of two more presents outside the door this minute." "Oh me, what richness!" cried Rose, much excited. "I used to wish for a pair of glass slippers like Cinderella's, but as I can't have them, I really don't know what to ask for." Phoebe clapped her hands as she skipped off the bed and ran to the door, saying merrily, "One of them is for your feet, anyway. I don't know what you'll say to the other, but I think it's elegant." So did Rose, when a shining pair of skates and a fine sled appeared. "Uncle sent those, I know he did, and now I see them, I remember that I did want to skate and coast. Isn't it a beauty? See, they fit nicely." And sitting on the new sled, Rose tried a skate on her bare little foot, while Phoebe stood by admiring the pretty tableau. "Now we must hurry and get dressed, for there's a deal to do to day, and I want to get through in time to try my sled before dinner." "Gracious me, and I ought to be dusting my parlors this blessed minute," and mistress and maid separated with such happy faces that any one would have known what day it was without being told. "Birnam Wood has come to Dunsinane, Rosie," said Dr. Alec, as he left the breakfast table to open the door for a procession of holly, hemlock, and cedar boughs that came marching up the steps. Snowballs and "Merry Christmases" flew about pretty briskly for several minutes, then all fell to work trimming the old house, for the family always dined together there on that day. "I rode miles and mileses, as Ben says, to get this fine bit, and I'm going to hang it there as the last touch to the rigamadooning," said Charlie, as he fastened a dull green branch to the chandelier in the front parlor. "It isn't very pretty," said Rose, who was trimming the chimney piece with glossy holly sprays. "Never mind that, it's mistletoe, and any one who stands under it will get kissed whether they like it or not. Now's your time, ladies," answered the saucy prince, keeping his place and looking sentimentally at the girls, who retired precipitately from the dangerous spot. "You won't catch me," said Rose, with great dignity. "See if I don't." "I've got my eye on Phoebe," observed Will, in a patronizing tone that made them all laugh. "Bless the dear, I shan't mind a bit," answered Phoebe, with such a maternal air that Will's budding gallantry was chilled to death. "Oh, the mistletoe bough!" sang Rose. "Oh, the mistletoe bough!" echoed all the boys, and the teasing ended in the plaintive ballad they all liked so well. There was plenty of time to try the new skates before dinner, and then Rose took her first lesson on the little bay, which seemed to have frozen over for that express purpose. She found tumbling down and getting up again warm work for a time, but with 6 boys to teach her, she managed at last to stand alone, and, satisfied with that success, she refreshed herself with a dozen grand coasts on the Amazon, as her sled was called. "Ah, that fatal color! It breaks my heart to see it," croaked Aunt Myra, as Rose came down a little late, with cheeks almost as ruddy as the holly berries on the wall, and every curl as smooth as Phoebe's careful hands could make it. "I'm glad to see that Alec allows the poor child to make herself pretty in spite of his absurd notions," added Aunt Clara, taking infinite satisfaction in the fact that Rose's blue silk dress had 3 frills on it. "She is a very intelligent child, and has a nice little manner of her own," observed Aunt Jane, with unusual affability, for Rose had just handed Mac a screen to guard his eyes from the brilliant fire. "If I had a daughter like that to show Jem when he gets home, I should be a very proud and happy woman," thought Aunt Jessie, and then reproached herself for not being perfectly satisfied with her 4 brave lads. Aunt Plenty was too absorbed in the dinner to have an eye for anything else. If she had not been, she would have seen what an effect her new cap produced on the boys. The good lady owned that she did love a dressy cap, and on this occasion her headgear was magnificent, for the towering structure of lace was adorned with buff ribbons to such an extent that it looked as if a flock of yellow butterflies had settled on her dear old head. When she trotted about the rooms, the ruches quivered, the little bows all stood erect, and the streamers waved in the breeze so comically that it was absolutely necessary for Archie to smother the brats in the curtains till they had had their first laugh out. Uncle Mac had brought Fun-See to dinner, and it was a mercy he did, for the elder lads found a vent for their merriment in joking the young Chinaman on his improved appearance. He was in American costume now, with a cropped head, and spoke remarkably good English after 6 months at school, but, for all that, his yellow face and beady eyes made a curious contrast to the blond Campbells all about him. Will called him the Typhoon, meaning tycoon, and the name stuck to him to his great disgust. Aunt Peace was brought down and set in the chair of state at the table, for she never failed to join the family on this day, and sat smiling at them all. "Like an embodiment of peace on earth," Uncle Alec said, as he took his place beside her, while Uncle Mac supported Aunt Plenty at the other end. "I ate hardly any breakfast, and I've done everything I know to make myself extra hungry, but I really don't think I can eat straight through, unless I burst my buttons off," whispered Geordie to Will, as he surveyed the bounteous stores before him with a hopeless sigh. "A fellow never knows what he can do till he tries," answered Will, attacking his heaped-up plate with an evident intention of doing his duty like a man. Everybody knows what a Christmas dinner is, so we need waste no words in describing this one, but hasten at once to tell what happened at the end of it. The end, by the way, was so long in coming that the gas was lighted before dessert was over, for a snow flurry had come on, and the wintry daylight faded fast. But that only made it all the jollier in the warm, bright rooms, full of happy souls. Every one was very merry, but Archie seemed particularly uplifted, so much so that Charlie confided to Rose that he was afraid the chief had been at the decanters. Rose indignantly denied the insinuation, for when the healths were drunk in the good old-fashioned way to suit the elders, she had observed that Aunt Jessie's boys filled their glasses with water, and had done the same herself in spite of the prince's jokes about the rosy. But Archie certainly was unusually excited,
and when someone remembered that it was the anniversary of Uncle Jem's wedding, and wished he was there to make a speech, his son electrified the family by trying to do it for him. It was rather incoherent and flowery, as maiden speeches are apt to be, but the end was considered superb, for, turning to his mother with a queer little choke in his voice, he said that she deserved to be blessed with peace and plenty, to be crowned with roses and lad's love, and to receive the cargo of happiness sailing home to her in spite of wind or tide, to add another gem to the family jewels. That allusion to the captain, now on his return trip, made Mrs. Jessie sob in her napkin, and set the boys cheering. Then, as if that was not sensation enough, Archie suddenly dashed out of the room, as if he had lost his wits. "Too bashful to stay and be praised," began Charlie, excusing the peculiarities of his chief, as in duty bound. "Phoebe beckoned him. I saw her," cried Rose, staring hard at the door. "Is it more presents coming?" asked Jamie, just as his brother reappeared, looking more excited than ever. "Yes, a present for mother, and here it is!" roared Archie, flinging wide the door to let in a tall man, who cried out, "Where's my little woman? The first kiss for her, then the rest may come on as fast as they like." Before the words were out of his mouth, Mrs. Jessie was half hidden under his rough greatcoat, and 4 boys were prancing about him, clamoring for their turn. Of course, there was a joyful tumult for a time, during which Rose slipped into the window recess and watched what went on, as if it were a chapter in a Christmas story. It was good to see bluff Uncle Jem look proudly at his tall son, and fondly hug the little ones. It was better still to see him shake his brothers' hands as if he would never leave off, and kiss all the sisters in a way that made even solemn Aunt Myra brighten up for a minute. But it was best of all to see him finally established in grandfather's chair, with his little woman beside him, his 3 youngest boys in his lap, and Archie hovering over him like a large-sized cherub. That really was, as Charlie said, a landscape to do one's heart good. "All hearty and all here, thank God," said Captain Jem, in the first pause that came, as he looked about him with a grateful face. "All but Rose," answered loyal little Jamie, remembering the absent. "Faith, I forgot the child. Where is George's little girl?" asked the captain, who had not seen her since she was a baby. "You'd better say Alec's great girl," said Uncle Mac, who professed to be madly jealous of his brother. "Here I am, sir," and Rose appeared from behind the curtains, looking as if she had rather have stayed there. "St. George Germain, how the mite has grown!" cried Captain Jem, as he tumbled the boys out of his lap, and rose to greet the tall girl like a gentleman, as he was. But somehow, when he shook her hand, it looked so small in his big one, and her face reminded him so strongly of his dead brother, that he was not satisfied with so cold a welcome, and with a sudden softening of the keen eyes, he took her up in his arms, whispering, with a rough cheek against her smooth one, "God bless you, child. Forgive me if I forgot you for a minute, and be sure that not one of your kinsfolk is happier to see you here than Uncle Jem." That made it all right, and when he set her down, Rose's face was so bright it was evident that some spell had been used to banish the feeling of neglect that had kept her moping behind the curtain so long. That everyone sat around and heard all about the voyage home, how the captain had set his heart on getting there in time to keep Christmas, how everything had conspired to thwart his plan, and how, at the very last minute, he had managed to do it, and had sent a telegram to Archie bidding him keep the secret, and be ready for his father at any moment, for the ship got into another port and he might be late. Then Archie told how that telegram had burnt in his pocket all dinner time, how he had had to take Phoebe into his confidence, and how clever she was to keep the captain back till the speech was over, and he could come in with effect. The elders would have sat and talked all the evening, but the young folks were bent on having their usual Christmas frolic. So, after an hour of pleasant chat, they began to get restless, and having consulted together in dumb show, they devised a way to very effectually break up the family council. Steve vanished, and sooner than the boys imagined Dandy could get himself up, the skirl of the bagpipe was heard in the hall, and the bonny piper came to lead Clan Campbell to the revel. "Draw it mild, Stenny, my man. Ye play unco weel, but ye make a most infernal din," cried Uncle Jem, with his hands over his ears, for this accomplishment was new to him, and "took him all aback," as he expressed it. So Steve droned out a Highland reel as softly as he could, and the boys danced it to a circle of admiring relations. Captain Jem was a true sailor, however, and could not stand idle while anything lively was going on. So, when the piper's breath gave out, he cut a splendid pigeon wing into the middle of the hall, saying, "Who can dance a fore and after?" and waiting for no reply, began to whistle the air so invitingly that Mrs. Jessie set to him, laughing like a girl. Rose and Charlie took their places behind, and away went the four with a spirit and a skill that inspired all the rest to cut in as fast as they could. That was a grand beginning, and they had many another dance before any one would own they were tired. Even Fun C distinguished himself with Aunt Plenty, whom he greatly admired as the stoutest lady in the company, plumpness being considered a beauty in his country. The merry old soul professed herself immensely flattered by his admiration, and the boys declared she set her cap at him, else he would never have dared to catch her under the mistletoe, and, rising on the tips of his own toes, gallantly salute her fat cheek. How they all laughed at her astonishment, and how Fun's little black eyes twinkled over this exploit. Charlie put him up to it, and Charlie was so bent on catching Rose that he laid all sorts of pitfalls for her, and bribed the other lads to help him. But Rose was wide awake, and escaped all his snares, professing a great contempt for such foolish customs. Poor Phoebe did not fare so well, and Archie was the only one who took a base advantage of her, as she stood innocently offering tea to Aunt Myra, whom she happened to meet just under the fatal bough. If his father's arrival had not rather upset him, I doubt if the dignified chief would have done it, for he apologized at once in the handsomest manner, and caught the tray that nearly dropped from Phoebe's hands. Jamie boldly invited all the ladies to come and salute him, and as for Uncle Jem, he behaved as if the entire room was a grove of mistletoe. Uncle Alec slyly laid a bit of it on Aunt Peace's cap, and then softly kissed her, which little joke seemed to please her very much, for she liked to have part in all the home pastimes, and Alec was her favorite nephew. Charlie alone failed to catch his shy bird, and the oftener she escaped the more determined he was to ensnare her. When every other wile had been tried in vain, he got Archie to propose a game with forfeits. "I understand that dodge," thought Rose, and was on her guard so carefully that not one among the pile soon collected belonged to her. "Now let us redeem them and play something else," said Will, quite unconscious of the deeply laid plots all about him. "One more round and then we will," answered the prince, who had now baited his trap anew. Just as the question came to Rose, Jamie's voice was heard in the hall, crying distressfully, "Oh, come quick, quick!" Rose started up, missed the question, and was greeted with a general cry of "Forfeit, forfeit!" in which the little traitor came to join. "Now I've got her," thought the young rascal, exulting in his fun-loving soul. "Now I'm lost," thought Rose, as she gave up her pincushion, with a sternly defiant look that would have daunted any one but the reckless prince. In fact, it made even him think twice, and resolve to let Rose off easy, she had been so clever. "Here's a very pretty pawn, and what shall be done to redeem it?" asked Steve, holding the pincushion over Charlie's head, for he had insisted on being judge, and kept that for the last. "Fine or superfine?" "Super." "Well, she shall take old Mac under the mistletoe, and kiss him prettily. Won't he be mad, though!" And this bad boy chuckled over the discomfort he had caused two harmless beings.
There was an impressive pause among the young folks in their corner, for they all knew that Mac would be mad, since he hated nonsense of this sort, and had gone to talk with the elders when the game began. At this moment he was standing before the fire, listening to a discussion between his uncles and his father, looking as wise as a young owl, and blissfully unconscious of the plots against him. Charlie expected that Rose would say, "I won't." Therefore he was rather astonished, not to say gratified, when, after a look at the victim, she laughed suddenly, and going up to the group of gentlemen, drew her Uncle Mac under the mistletoe, and surprised him with a hearty kiss. "Thank you, my dear," said the innocent gentleman, looking much pleased at the unexpected honor. "Oh, come, that's not fair," began Charlie, but Rose cut him short by saying, as she made him a fine courtesy, "You said old Mac, and though it was very disrespectful, I did it. That was your last chance, sir, and you've lost it." He certainly had, for, as he spoke, Rose pulled down the mistletoe and threw it into the fire, while the boys jeered at the crestfallen prince, and exalted quick-witted Rose to the skies. "What's the joke?" asked young Mac, waked out of a brown study by the laughter in which the elders joined. But there was a regular shout when, the matter having been explained to him, Mac took a meditative stare at Rose through his goggles, and said in a philosophical tone, "Well, I don't think I should have minded much if she had done it." That tickled the lads immensely, and nothing but the appearance of a slight refection would have induced them to stop chaffing the poor worm, who could not see anything funny in the beautiful resignation he had shown on this trying occasion. Soon after this the discovery of Jamie curled up in the sofa corner, as sound asleep as a dormouse, suggested the propriety of going home, and a general move was made. They were all standing about the hall, lingering over the good nights, when the sound of a voice softly singing "Sweet Home" made them pause and listen. It was Phoebe, poor little Phoebe, who never had a home, never knew the love of father or mother, brother or sister, who stood all alone in the wide world, yet was not sad nor afraid, but took her bits of happiness gratefully, and sung over her work without a thought of discontent. I fancy the happy family standing there together remembered this, and felt the beauty of it, for when the solitary voice came to the burden of its song, other voices took it up and finished it so sweetly that the old house seemed to echo the word "home" in the ears of both the orphan girls, who had just spent their first Christmas under its hospitable roof. Chapter 21. A Scare. "Brother Alec, you surely don't mean to allow that child to go out such a bitter cold day as this," said Mrs. Myra, looking into the study where the doctor sat reading his paper one February morning. "Why not? If a delicate invalid like yourself can bear it, surely my hearty girl can, especially as she is dressed for cold weather," answered Dr. Alec, with provoking confidence. "But you have no idea how sharp the wind is. I am chilled to the very marrow of my bones," answered Aunt Myra, chafing the end of her purple nose with her somber glove. "I don't doubt it, ma'am, if you will wear crape and silk instead of fur and flannel. Rosie goes out in all weathers, and will be none the worse for an hour's brisk skating." "Well, I warn you that you are trifling with the child's health, and depending too much on the seeming improvement she has made this year. She is a delicate creature for all that, and will drop away suddenly at the first serious attack, as her poor mother did," croaked Aunt Myra, with a despondent wag of the big bonnet. "I'll risk it," answered Dr. Alec, knitting his brows, as he always did when any allusion was made to that other Rose. "Mark my words, you will repent it." And with that awful prophecy Aunt Myra departed like a black shadow. Now it must be confessed that among the doctor's failings, and he had his share, was a very masculine dislike of advice which was thrust upon him unasked. He always listened with respect to the great aunts, and often consulted Mrs. Jessie, but the other three ladies tried his patience sorely. by constant warnings, complaints, and counsels. Aunt Myra was an especial trial, and he always turned contrary the moment she began to talk. He could not help it, and often laughed about it with comic frankness. Here now was a sample of it, for he had just been thinking that Rose had better defer her run till the wind went down and the sun was warmer. But Aunt Myra spoke, and he could not resist the temptation to make light of her advice, and let Rose brave the cold. He had no fear of its harming her, for she went out every day, and it was a great satisfaction to him to see her run down the avenue a minute afterward, with her skates on her arm, looking like a rosy-faced Eskimo in her sealskin suit, as she smiled at Aunt Myra, stalking along as solemnly as a crow. "I hope the child won't stay out long, for this wind is enough to chill the marrow in younger bones than Myra's," thought Dr. Alec, half an hour later, as he drove toward the city to see the few patients he had consented to take for old acquaintances' sake. The thought returned several times that morning, for it was truly a bitter day, and in spite of his bearskin coat, the doctor shivered. But he had great faith in Rose's good sense, and it never occurred to him that she was making a little Casa Bianca of herself, with the difference of freezing instead of burning at her post. You see, Mac had made an appointment to meet her at a certain spot, and have a grand skating bout as soon as the few lessons he was allowed were over. She had promised to wait for him, and did so with a faithfulness that cost her dear, because Mac forgot his appointment when the lessons were done, and became absorbed in a chemical experiment, till a general combustion of gases drove him out of his laboratory. Then he suddenly remembered Rose, and would gladly have hurried away to her, but his mother forbade his going out, for the sharp wind would hurt his eyes. "She will wait and wait, mother, for she always keeps her word, and I told her to hold on till I came," explained Mac, with visions of a shivering little figure watching on the windy hilltop. "Of course your uncle won't let her go out such a day as this. If he does, she will have the sense to come here for you, or to go home again when you don't appear," said Aunt Jane, returning to her "What's on the mind." "I wish Steve would just cut up and see if she's there, since I can't go," began Mac anxiously. "Steve won't stir a peg, thank you." "He's got his own toes to thaw out, and wants his dinner," answered Dandy, just in from school, and wrestling impatiently with his boots. So Mac resigned himself, and Rose waited dutifully till dinner time assured her that her waiting was in vain. She had done her best to keep warm, had skated till she was tired and hot, then stood watching others till she was chilled, tried to get up a glow again by trotting up and down the road, but failed to do so, and finally cuddled disconsolately under a pine tree to wait and watch. When she at length started for home, she was benumbed with cold, and could hardly make her way against the wind that buffeted the frostbitten Rose most unmercifully. Dr. Alec was basking in the warmth of the study fire after his drive, when the sound of a stifled sob made him hurry to the door and look anxiously into the hall. Rose lay in a shivering bunch near the register, with her things half off, wringing her hands, and trying not to cry with the pain returning warmth brought to her half-frozen fingers. "My darling, what is it?" and Uncle Alec had her in his arms in a minute. "Mac didn't come. I can't get warm. The fire makes me ache," and with a long shiver Rose burst out crying, while her teeth chattered and her poor little nose was so blue it made one's heart ache to see it. In less time than it takes to tell it, Dr. Alec had her on the sofa rolled up in the bearskin coat, with Phoebe rubbing her cold feet while he rubbed the aching hands, and Aunt Plenty made a comfortable hot drink, and Aunt Peace sent down her own foot warmer and an embroidered blanket for the dear. Full of remorseful tenderness, Uncle Alec worked over his new patient till she declared she was all right again. He would not let her get up to dinner, but fed her himself, and then forgot his own while he sat watching her fall into a drowse, for Aunt Plenty's cordial made her sleepy. She lay so for several hours, for the drowse deepened into a heavy sleep, and Uncle Alec, still at his post, saw with growing anxiety that a feverish color began to burn in her cheeks, that her breathing was quick and uneven, and now and then she gave a little moan, as if in pain. Suddenly she woke up with a start, and seeing Aunt Plenty bending over her, put out her arms like a sick child, saying wearily, "Please, could I go to bed?" "The best place for you, dearie. Take her right up, Alec. I've got the hot water ready, and after a nice bath she shall have a cup of my sage tea, and be rolled up in blankets to sleep off her cold," answered the old lady, cheerily, as she bustled away to give orders. "Are you in pain, darling?" asked Uncle Alec, as he carried her up. "My side aches when I breathe, and I feel stiff and queer, but it isn't bad, so don't be troubled, uncle," whispered Rose, with a little hot hand against his cheek. But the poor doctor did look troubled, and had cause to do so, for just then Rose tried to laugh at Dolly charging into the room with the warming pan, but could not, for the sharp pain took her breath away, and made her cry out. "Pleurisy," sighed Aunt Plenty from the depths of the bathtub. "Poomonia," groaned Dolly, burrowing among the bedclothes with the long-handled pan, as if bent on fishing up that treacherous disease. "Oh, is it bad?" asked Phoebe, nearly dropping a pail of hot water in her dismay, for she knew nothing of sickness, and Dolly's suggestion had a peculiarly dreadful sound to her. "Hush!" ordered the doctor, in a tone that silenced all further predictions, and made everyone work with a will. "Make her as comfortable as you can, and when she is in her little bed I'll come and say good night," he added, when the bath was ready, and the blankets browning nicely before the fire. Then he went away to talk quite cheerfully to Aunt Peace about its being only a chill, after which he tramped up and down the hall, pulling his beard and knitting his brows, sure signs of great inward perturbation. "I thought it would be too good luck to get through the year without a downfall. Confound my perversity! Why couldn't I take Myra's advice and keep Rose at home? It's not fair that the poor child should suffer for my sinful overconfidence. She shall not suffer for it. Pneumonia, indeed! I defy it!" And he shook his fist in the ugly face of an Indian idol that happened to be before him, as if that particularly hideous god had some spite against his own little goddess. In spite of his defiance, his heart sank when he saw Rose again, for the pain was worse, and the bath and blankets, the warming pan and piping hot sage tea were all in vain. For several hours there was no rest for the poor child, and all manner of gloomy forebodings haunted the minds of those who hovered about her, with faces full of the tenderest anxiety. In the midst of the worst paroxysm, Charlie came to leave a message from his mother, and was met by Phoebe coming despondently downstairs with a mustard plaster that had brought no relief. "What the dickens is the matter? You look as dismal as a tombstone," he said, as she held up her hand to stop his lively whistling. "Miss Rose is dreadful sick." "The deuce she is!" "Don't swear, Mr. Charlie. She really is, and it's Mr. Mac's fault." And Phoebe told the sad tale in a few sharp words, for she felt at war with the entire race of boys at that moment. "I'll give it to him. Make your mind easy about that," said Charlie, with an ominous doubling up of his fist. "But Rose isn't dangerously ill, is she?" he added anxiously, as Aunt Plenty was seen to trot across the upper hall, shaking a bottle violently as she went. "Oh, but she is, though. The doctor don't say much, but he don't call it a chill any more. It's pleurisy now, and I'm so afraid it will be pneumonia to-morrow," answered Phoebe, with a despairing glance at the plaster. Charlie exploded into a stifled laugh at the new pronunciation of pneumonia, to Phoebe's great indignation. "How can you have the heart to do it, and she in such horrid pain? Hark to that, and then laugh if you darst," she said with a tragic gesture, and her black eyes full of fire. Charlie listened and heard little moans that went to his heart, and made his face as sober as Phoebe's. "Oh, uncle, please stop the pain, and let me rest a minute. Don't tell the boys I wasn't brave. I try to bear it, but it's so sharp I can't help crying." Neither could Charlie when he heard the broken voice say that, but, boylike, he wouldn't own it, and said pettishly as he rubbed his sleeve across his eyes: "Don't hold that confounded thing right under my nose. The mustard makes my eyes smart." "Don't see how it can, when it hasn't any more strength in it than meal. The doctor said so, and I'm going to get some better," began Phoebe, not a bit ashamed of the great tears that were bedewing the condemned plaster. "I'll go," and Charlie was off like a shot, glad of an excuse to get out of sight for a few minutes. When he came back, all inconvenient emotion had been disposed of, and, having delivered a box of the hottest mustard procurable for money, he departed to blow up Mac, that being his next duty, in his opinion. He did it so energetically and so thoroughly that the poor worm was cast into the depths of remorseful despair, and went to bed that evening feeling that he was an outcast from among men, and bore the mark of Cain upon his brow. Thanks to the skill of the doctor and the devotion of his helpers, Rose grew easier about midnight, and all hoped that the worst was over. Phoebe was making tea by the study fire, for the doctor had forgotten to eat and drink since Rose was ill, and Aunt Plenty insisted on his having a good cordial dish of tea after his exertions. A tap on the window startled Phoebe, and, looking up, she saw a face peering in. She was not afraid, for a second look showed her that it was neither ghost nor burglar, but Mac, looking pale and wild in the wintry moonlight. "Come and let a fellow in," he said in a low tone, and when he stood in the hall, he clutched Phoebe's arm, whispering gruffly, "How is Rose?" "Thanks be to goodness, she's better," answered Phoebe, with a smile that was like broad sunshine to the poor lad's anxious heart. "And she will be all right again to-morrow?" "Oh, dear, no. Dolly says she's sure to have rheumatic fever if she don't have pneumonia," answered Phoebe, careful to pronounce the word rightly this time. Down went Mac's face, and remorse began to gnaw at him again as he gave a great sigh and said doubtfully, "I suppose I couldn't see her?" "Of course not at this time o' night, when we want her to go to sleep." Mac opened his mouth to say something more, when a sneeze came upon him unawares, and a loud "Ah rush hoo!" awoke the depths of the quiet house. "Why didn't you stop it?" said Phoebe reproachfully. "I dare say you've waked her up." "Didn't know it was coming. Just my luck!" groaned Mac, turning to go before his unfortunate presence did more harm. But a voice from the stairhead called softly, "Mac, come up. Rose wants to see you." Up he went and found his uncle waiting for him. "What brings you here at this hour, my boy?" asked the doctor in a whisper. "Charlie said it was all my fault, and if she died I'd killed her. I couldn't sleep, so I came to see how she was, and no one knows it but Steve," he said, with such a troubled face and voice that the doctor had not the heart to blame him. Before he could say anything more, a feeble voice called, "Mac!" and with a hasty, "Stay a minute just to please her, and then slip away, for I want her to sleep," the doctor led him into the room. The face on the pillow looked very pale and childish, and the smile that welcomed Mac was very faint, for Rose was spent with pain, yet could not rest till she had said a word of comfort to her cousin. "I knew your funny sneeze, and I guessed that you came to see how I did, though it is very late. Don't be worried, I'm better now, and it is my fault I was ill, not yours, for I needn't have been so silly as to wait in the cold, just because I said I would." Mac hastened to explain, to load himself with reproaches, and to beg her not to die on any account, for Charlie's lecture had made a deep impression on the poor boy's mind. "I didn't know there was any danger of my dying," and Rose looked up at him with a solemn expression in her great eyes. "Oh, I hope not, but people do sometimes go suddenly, you know, and I couldn't rest till I'd asked you to forgive me," faltered Mac, thinking that Rose looked very like an angel already, with the golden hair loose on the pillow, and the meekness of suffering on her little white face. "I don't think I shall die. Uncle won't let me. But if I do, remember I forgave you." She looked at him with a tender light in her eyes, and, seeing how pathetic his dumb grief was, she added, softly, drawing his head down, "I wouldn't kiss you under the mistletoe, but I will now, for I want you to be sure I do forgive and love you just the same." That quite upset poor Mac. He could only murmur his thanks and get out of the room as fast as possible, to grope his way to the couch at the far end of the hall, and lie there till he fell asleep, worn out with trying not to make a baby of himself.
Chapter 22. Something to Do. Whatever danger there might have been from the effects of that sudden chill, it was soon over, though, of course, Aunt Myra refused to believe it, and Dr. Alec cherished his girl with redoubled vigilance and tenderness for months afterward. Rose quite enjoyed being sick, because as soon as the pain ended the fun began, and for a week or two she led the life of a little princess secluded in the bower, while every one served, amused, and watched over her in the most delightful manner. But the doctor was called away to see an old friend, who was dangerously ill, and then Rose felt like a young bird deprived of its mother's sheltering wing, especially on one afternoon when the aunts were taking their naps, and the house was very still within, while snow fell softly without. "I'll go and hunt up Phoebe. She is always nice and busy, and likes to have me help her. If Dolly is out of the way, we can make caramels and surprise the boys when they come," Rose said to herself, as she threw down her book, and felt ready for society of some sort. She took the precaution to peep through the slide before she entered the kitchen, for Dolly allowed no messing when she was round. But the coast was clear, and no one but Phoebe appeared, sitting at the table with her head on her arms, apparently asleep. Rose was just about to wake her with a "Boo!" when she lifted her head, dried her wet eyes with her blue apron, and fell to work with a resolute face on something she was evidently much interested in. Rose could not make out what it was, and her curiosity was greatly excited, for Phoebe was writing with a sputtering pen on some bits of brown paper, apparently copying something from a little book. "I must know what the dear thing is about, and why she cried and then set her lips tight and went to work with all her might," thought Rose, forgetting all about the caramels, and, going round to the door, she entered the kitchen, saying pleasantly, "Phoebe, I want something to do. Can't you let me help you about anything, or shall I be in the way?" "Oh, dear no, miss. I always love to have you round when things are tidy. What would you like to do?" answered Phoebe, opening a drawer as if about to sweep her own affairs out of sight. But Rose stopped her, exclaiming like a curious child, "Let me see. What is it? I won't tell if you'd rather not have Dolly know." "I'm only trying to study a bit, but I'm so stupid I don't get on much," answered the girl reluctantly, permitting her little mistress to examine the poor contrivances she was trying to work with. A broken slate that had blown off the roof, an inch or two of pencil, an old almanac for a reader, several bits of brown or yellow paper ironed smoothly and sewn together for a copybook, and the copy's sundry receipts written in Aunt Plenty's neat hand. These, with a small bottle of ink and a rusty pen, made up Phoebe's outfit, and it was little wonder that she did not "get on" in spite of the patient persistence that dried the desponding tears and drove along the sputtering pen with a will. "You may laugh if you want to, Miss Rose. I know my things are queer, and that's why I hide them, but I don't mind since you found me out, and I ain't a bit ashamed except of being so backward at my age," said Phoebe humbly, though her cheeks grew redder as she washed out some crooked capitals with a tear or two not yet dried upon the slate. "Laugh at you! I feel more like crying to think what a selfish girl I am, to have loads of books and things and never remember to give you some. Why didn't you come and ask me, and not go struggling along alone in this way? It was very wrong of you, Phoebe, and I'll never forgive you if you do so again," answered Rose, with one hand on Phoebe's shoulder, while the other gently turned the leaves of the poor little copybook. "I didn't like to ask for anything more when you are so good to me all the time, Miss, dear," began Phoebe, looking up with grateful eyes. Oh, you proud thing! Just as if it wasn't fun to give away, and I had the best of it. Now, see here, I've got a plan, and you mustn't say no, or I shall scold. I want something to do, and I'm going to teach you all I know. It won't take long." And Rose laughed as she put her arm around Phoebe's neck, and patted the smooth dark head with the kind little hand that so loved to give. It would be just heavenly, and Phoebe's face shone at the mere idea, but fell again as she added wistfully, "Only I'm afraid I ought not to let you do it, Miss Rose. It will take time, and maybe the doctor wouldn't like it. He didn't want me to study much, but he never said a word about teaching, and I don't believe he will mind a bit. Anyway, we can try it till he comes, so pack up your things and go right to my room, and we'll begin this very day. I truly like to do it, and we'll have nice times, see if we don't," cried Rose eagerly. It was a pretty sight to see Phoebe bundle her humble outfit into her apron, and spring up as if the desire of her heart had suddenly been made a happy fact to her. It was a still prettier sight to see Rose run gaily on before, smiling like a good fairy as she beckoned to the other, singing as she went, "The way into my parlor is up a winding stair, and many are the curious things I'll show you when you're there. Will you walk in, Phoebe dear?" "Oh, won't I?" answered Phoebe fervently, adding, as they entered the bower, "You are the dearest spider that ever was, and I'm the happiest fly." "I'm going to be very strict, so sit down in that chair and don't say a word till school is ready to open," ordered Rose, delighted with the prospect of such useful and pleasant something to do. So Phoebe sat demurely in her place, while her new teacher laid forth books and slates, a pretty inkstand and a little globe, hastily tore a bit off her big sponge, sharpened pencils with more energy than skill, and when all was ready gave a prance of satisfaction that set the pupil laughing. "Now the school is open, and I shall hear you read, so that I may know in which class to put you, Miss Moore," began Rose with great dignity, as she laid a book before her scholar, and sat down in the easy chair with a long rule in her hand. Phoebe did pretty well, only tripping now and then over a hard word, and pronouncing identical in a sober way that tickled Rose, though never a smile betrayed her. The spelling lesson which followed was rather discouraging. Phoebe's ideas of geography were very vague, and grammar was nowhere, though the pupil protested that she tried so hard to talk nice like educated folks, that Dolly called her a stuck-up piece who didn't know her place. Dolly's an old goose, so don't you mind her, for she will say nater, vittles, and doos as long as she lives, and insist that they are right. You do talk very nicely, Phoebe, I've observed it, and grammar will help you, and show you some things are right and others ain't, are not, I mean," added Rose, correcting herself, and feeling that she must mind her own parts of speech if she was to serve as an example for Phoebe. When the arithmetic came, the little teacher was surprised to find her scholar quicker in some things than herself, for Phoebe had worked away at the columns in the butcher's and baker's books till she could add so quickly and correctly that Rose was amazed, and felt that in this branch the pupil would soon excel the teacher if she kept on at the same pace. Her praise cheered Phoebe immensely, and they went bravely on, both getting so interested that the time flew unheeded, till Aunt Plenty appeared, exclaiming, as she stared at the two heads bent over one slate, "Bless my heart, what is going on now?" "School, Auntie. I'm teaching Phoebe, and it's great fun," cried Rose, looking up with a bright face. But Phoebe's was brighter, though she added with a wistful look, "Maybe I ought to have asked leave first, only when Miss Rose proposed this, I was so happy I forgot to. Shall I stop, ma'am?" "Of course not, child. I'm glad to see you fond of your book, and to find Rose helping you along. My blessed mother used to sit at work with her maids about her, teaching them many a useful thing in the good old fashion that's gone by now. Only don't neglect your work, dear, or let the books interfere with the duties." As Aunt Plenty spoke, with her kind old face beaming approvingly on the girls,
Phoebe glanced at the clock, saw that it pointed to 5, knew that Dolly would soon be down, expecting to find preparations for supper under way, and, hastily dropping her pencil, she jumped up, saying, "Please, can I go? I'll clear up after I've done my chores." "School is dismissed," answered Rose, and with a grateful "Thank you, heaps and heaps," Phoebe ran away singing the multiplication table as she set the tea ditto. That was the way it began, and for a week the class of 1 went on with great pleasure and profit to all concerned, for the pupil proved a bright one and came to her lessons as to a feast, while the young teacher did her best to be worthy the high opinion held of her, for Phoebe firmly believed that Miss Rose knew everything in the way of learning. Of course the lads found out what was going on, and chaffed the girls about the seminary, as they called the new enterprise, but they thought it a good thing on the whole, kindly offered to give lessons in Greek and Latin gratis, and decided among themselves that Rose was a little trump to give the Phoebe bird such a capital boost. Rose herself had some doubts as to how it would strike her uncle, and concocted a wheedlesome speech which should at once convince him that it was the most useful, wholesome, and delightful plan ever devised. But she got no chance to deliver her address, for Dr. Alec came upon her so unexpectedly that it went out of her head entirely. She was sitting on the floor in the library, poring over a big book laid open in her lap, and knew nothing of the long-desired arrival till 2 large, warm hands met under her chin and gently turned her head back, so that some one could kiss her heartily on either cheek, while a fatherly voice said, half reproachfully, "Why is my girl brooding over a dusty encyclopedia, when she ought to be running to meet the old gentleman who couldn't get on another minute without her?" "Oh, uncle, I'm so glad! And so sorry! Why didn't you let us know what time you'd be here, or call out the minute you came? Haven't I been homesick for you? And now I'm so happy to have you back I could hug your dear old curly head off," cried Rose, as the encyclopedia went down with a bang, and she up with a spring that carried her into Dr. Alec's arms, to be kept there in the sort of embrace a man gives to the dearest creature the world holds for him. Presently he was in his easy chair with Rose upon his knee, smiling up in his face and talking as fast as her tongue could go, while he watched her with an expression of supreme content as he stroked the smooth, round cheek, or held the little hand in his, rejoicing to see how rosy was the one, how plump and strong the other. "Have you had a good time? Did you save the poor lady? Aren't you glad to be home again with your girl to torment you?" "Yes, to all those questions. Now tell me what you've been at, little sinner. Auntie Plen says you want to consult me about some new and remarkable project which you have dared to start in my absence. She didn't tell you, I hope?" "Not a word more, except you were rather doubtful how I'd take it, and so wanted to 'fess yourself, and get round me as you always try to do, though you don't often succeed. Now then, own up, and take the consequences." So Rose told about her school, in her pretty, earnest way, dwelling on Phoebe's hunger for knowledge, and the delight it was to help her, adding with a wise nod, "And it helps me too, uncle, for she is so quick and eager I have to do my best, or she will get ahead of me in some things. To-day, now, she had the word cotton in a lesson, and asked all about it, and I was ashamed to find I really knew so little that I could only say that it was a plant that grew down south in a kind of pod, and was made into cloth. That's what I was reading up when you came, and to-morrow I shall tell her all about it, and indigo too. So you see it teaches me also, and is as good as a general review of what I've learned, in a pleasanter way than going over it alone." "You artful little baggage! That's the way you expect to get round me, is it? That's not studying, I suppose." "No, sir, it's teaching. And please, I like it much better than having a good time by myself. Besides, you know, I adopted Phoebe, and promised to be a sister to her, so I am bound to keep my word, am I not?" answered Rose, looking both anxious and resolute as she waited for her sentence. Dr. Alec was evidently already won, for Rose had described the old slate and brown paper copybook with a pathetic effect, and the excellent man had not only decided to send Phoebe to school long before the story was done, but reproached himself for forgetting his duty to one little girl in his love for another. So when Rose tried to look meek and failed utterly, he laughed and pinched her cheek, and answered in that genial way which adds such warmth and grace to any favor. "I haven't the slightest objection in the world. In fact, I was beginning to think I might let you go at your books again, moderately, since you are so well, and this is an excellent way to try your powers. Phoebe is a brave, bright lass, and shall have a fair chance in the world, if we can give it to her, so that if she ever finds her friends they need not be ashamed of her." "I think she has found some already," began Rose, eagerly. "Hey, what? Has any one turned up since I've been gone?" asked Dr. Alec quickly, for it was a firm belief in the family that Phoebe would prove to be somebody sooner or later. "No, her best friend turned up when you came home, uncle," answered Rose with an approving pat, adding gratefully, "I can't half thank you for being so good to my girl, but she will, because I know she is going to make a woman to be proud of. She's so strong and true and loving." "Bless your heart, dear, I haven't begun to do anything yet, more shame to me. But I'm going at it now, and as soon as she gets on a bit, she shall go to school as long as she likes. How will that do for a beginning?" "It will be just heavenly, as Phoebe says, for it is the wish of her life to get lots of schooling, and she will be too happy when I tell her. May I, please? It will be so lovely to see the dear thing open her big eyes and clap her hands at the splendid news. No one shall have a finger in this nice little pie. You shall do it all yourself. Only don't go too fast, or make too many castles in the air, my dear, for time and patience must go into this pie of ours if it is to turn out well." "Only when it is open, won't the birds begin to sing?" laughed Rose, taking a turn about the room as a vent for the joyful emotions that made her eyes shine. All of a sudden she stopped and asked soberly, "If Phoebe goes to school, who will do her work? I'm willing, if I can. Come here, and I'll tell you a secret. Dolly's bones are getting so troublesome, and her dear old temper so bad, that the aunts have decided to pension her off, and let her go and live with her daughter, who has married very well. I saw her this week, and she'd like to have her mother come. So in the spring we shall have a grand change, and get a new cook and chamber girl, if any can be found to suit our honored relatives. Oh me! How can I ever get on without Phoebe? Couldn't she stay, just so I could see her? I'd pay her board rather than have her go, I'm so fond of her." How Dr. Alec laughed at that proposal, and how satisfied Rose was when he explained that Phoebe was still to be her maid, with no duties except such as she could easily perform between school hours. "She is a proud creature for all her humble ways, and even from us would not take a favor if she did not earn it somewhere. So this arrangement makes it all square and comfortable, you see, and she will pay for the schooling by curling these Goldilocks a dozen times a day if you let her." "Your plans are always so wise and kind. That's why they work so well, I suppose, and why people let you do what you like with them. I really don't see how other girls get along without an Uncle Alec," answered Rose, with a sigh of pity for those who had missed so great a blessing. When Phoebe was told the splendid news, she did not stand on her head with rapture, as Charlie prophesied she would, but took it quietly, because it was such a happy thing she had no words big and beautiful enough to thank them in, she said, but every hour of her day was brightened by this granted wish, and dedicated to the service of those who gave it. Her heart was so full of content that it overflowed in music, and the sweet voice singing all about the house gave thanks so blithely that no other words were needed. Her willing feet were never tired of taking steps for those who had smoothed her way, her skilful hands were always busy in some labor of love for them, and on the face fast growing in comeliness there was an almost womanly expression of devotion, which proved how well Phoebe had already learned one of life's greatest lessons, gratitude. Chapter 23. Peacemaking. "Steve, I want you to tell me something," said Rose to Dandy, who was making faces at himself in the glass, while he waited for an answer to the note he brought from his mother to Aunt Plenty. "P'raps I will and p'raps I won't. What is it?" "Haven't Arch and Charlie quarreled?" "Dare say. We fellows are always having little rows, you know. I do believe a sty is coming on my starboard eye," and Steve affected to be absorbed in a survey of his yellow lashes. "No, that won't do. I want to know all about it, for I'm sure something more serious than a little row is the matter. Come, please tell me, Steenie, there's a dear." "Botheration! You don't want me to turn telltale, do you?" growled Steve, pulling his topknot as he always did when perplexed. "Yes, I do," was Rose's decided answer, for she saw from his manner that she was right, and determined to have the secret out of him if coaxing would do it. "I don't wish you to tell things to every one, of course, but to me you may, and you must, because I have a right to know. You boys need somebody to look after you, and I'm going to do it, for girls are nice peacemakers, and know how to manage people. Uncle said so, and he is never wrong." Steve was about to indulge in a derisive hoot at the idea of her looking after them, but a sudden thought restrained him, and suggested a way in which he could satisfy Rose and better himself at the same time. "What will you give me if I tell you every bit about it?" he asked, with a sudden red in his cheeks and an uneasy look in his eyes, for he was half ashamed of the proposition. "What do you want?" and Rose looked up rather surprised at his question. "I'd like to borrow some money. I shouldn't think of asking you, only Mac never has a cent since he set up his old chemical shop, where he'll blow himself to bits some day, and you and Uncle will have the fun of putting him together again." And Steve tried to look as if the idea amused him. "I'll lend it to you with pleasure, so tell away," said Rose, bound to get at the secret. Evidently much relieved by the promise, Steve set his topknot cheerfully erect again, and briefly stated the case. "As you say, it's all right to tell you, but don't let the boys know I blabbed, or Prince will take my head off. You see, Archie don't like some of the fellows Charlie goes with, and cuts 'em. That makes Prince mad, and he holds on just to plague Arch, so they don't speak to one another, if they can help it, and that's the row." "Are those boys bad?" asked Rose anxiously. "Guess not, only rather wild. They are older than our fellows, but they like Prince, he's such a jolly boy, sings so well, dances jigs and breakdowns, you know, and plays any game that's going. He beat Morse at billiards, and that's something to brag of, for Morse thinks he knows everything. I saw the match, and it was great fun." Steve got quite excited over the prowess of Charlie, whom he admired immensely, and tried to imitate. Rose did not know half the danger of such gifts and tastes as Charlie's, but felt instinctively that something must be wrong if Archie disapproved. "If Prince likes any billiard-playing boy better than Archie, I don't think much of his sense," she said severely. "Of course he doesn't, but you see, Charlie and Arch are both as proud as they can be, and won't give in. I suppose Arch is right, but I don't blame Charlie a bit for liking to be with the others sometimes. They are such a jolly set." And Steve shook his head morally, even while his eye twinkled over the memory of some of the exploits of the jolly set. "Oh, dear me," sighed Rose. "I don't see what I can do about it, but I wish the boys would make up, for Prince can't come to any harm with Archie, he's so good and sensible." "That's the trouble. Arch preaches, and Prince won't stand it. He told Arch he was a prig and a parson, and Arch told him he wasn't a gentleman. My boots, weren't they both mad, though! I thought for a minute they'd pitch into one another and have it out. Wish they had, and not gone stalking round, stiff and glum, ever since. Mac and I settle our rows with a bat or so over the head, and then we are all right." Rose couldn't help laughing as Steve sparred away at a fat sofa pillow to illustrate his meaning, and, having given it several scientific whacks, he pulled down his cuffs and smiled upon her with benign pity for her feminine ignorance of this summary way of settling a quarrel. "What droll things boys are," she said, with a mixture of admiration and perplexity in her face, which Steve accepted as a compliment to his sex. "We're a pretty clever invention, miss, and you can't get on without us," he answered, with his nose in the air. Then, taking a sudden plunge into business, he added, "How about that bit of money you were going to lend me? I've told you. Now you pay up." "Of course I will. How much do you want?" and Rose pulled out her purse. "Could you spare $5? I want to pay a little debt of honor that is rather pressing." And Steve put on a mannish air that was comical to see. "Aren't all debts honorable?" asked innocent Rose. "Yes, of course, but this is a bet I made, and it ought to be settled up at once," began Steve, finding it awkward to explain. "Oh, don't bet. It's not right, and I know your father wouldn't like it. Promise you won't do so again. Please promise." And Rose held fast the hand into which she had just put the money. "Well, I won't. It's worried me a good deal, but I was joked into it." "Much obliged, cousin. I'm all right now," and Steve departed hastily. Having decided to be a peacemaker, Rose waited for an opportunity, and very soon it came. She was spending the day with Aunt Clara, who had been entertaining some young guests, and invited Rose to meet them, for she thought it high time her niece conquered her bashfulness and saw a little of society. Dinner was over, and every one had gone. Aunt Clara was resting before going out to an evening party, and Rose was waiting for Charlie to come and take her home. She sat alone in the elegant drawing-room, feeling particularly nice and pretty, for she had her best frock on, a pair of gold bands her aunt had just given her, and a tea rosebud in her sash, like the beautiful Miss Van Tassel whom every one admired. She had spread out her little skirts to the best advantage, and, leaning back in a luxurious chair, sat admiring her own feet in new slippers with rosettes almost as big as dahlias. Presently Charlie came lounging in, looking rather sleepy and queer, Rose thought. On seeing her, however, he roused up and said with a smile that ended in a gape, "I thought you were with mother, so I took 40 winks after I got those girls off. Now I'm at your service, Rosamunda, whenever you like." "You look as if your head ached. If it does, don't mind me. I'm not afraid to run home alone, it's so early," answered Rose, observing the flushed cheeks and heavy eyes of her cousin. "I think I see myself letting you do it. Champagne always makes my head ache, but the air will set me up." "Why do you drink it, then?" asked Rose, anxiously. "Can't help it when I'm host." "Now, don't you begin to lecture. I've had enough of Archie's old-fashioned notions, and I don't want any more." Charlie's tone was decidedly cross, and his whole manner so unlike his usual merry good nature, that Rose felt crushed, and answered meekly, "I wasn't going to lecture. Only when people like other people, they can't bear to see them suffer pain." That brought Charlie round at once, for Rose's lips trembled a little, though she tried to hide it by smelling the flowers she pulled from her sash. "I'm a regular bear, and I beg your pardon for being so cross, Rosie," he said, in the old frank way that was so winning. "I wish you'd beg Archie's too, and be good friends again. You never were cross when he was your chum," Rose said, looking up at him as he bent toward her from the low chimney-piece, where he had been leaning his elbows. In an instant he stood as stiff and straight as a ramrod, and the heavy eyes kindled with an angry spark as he said, in his high and mighty manner, "You'd better not meddle with what you don't understand, cousin." "But I do understand, and it troubles me very much to see you so cold and stiff to one another.
You always used to be together, and now you hardly speak. You are so ready to beg my pardon, I don't see why you can't beg Archie's, if you are in the wrong." "I'm not." This was so short and sharp that Rose started, and Charlie added, in a calmer but still very haughty tone, "A gentleman always begs pardon when he has been rude to a lady, but one man doesn't apologize to another man who has insulted him." "Oh, my heart, what a pepper pot!" thought Rose, and, hoping to make him laugh, she added slyly, "I was not talking about men, but boys, and one of them a prince, who ought to set a good example to his subjects." But Charlie would not relent, and tried to turn the subject by saying gravely, as he unfastened the little gold ring from his watch guard, "I've broken my word, so I want to give this back and free you from the bargain. I'm sorry, but I think it a foolish promise, and don't intend to keep it. Choose a pair of earrings to suit yourself as my forfeit. You have a right to wear them now." "No, I can only wear one, and that is no use, for Archie will keep his word, I'm sure." Rose was so mortified and grieved at this downfall of her hopes that she spoke sharply, and would not take the ring the deserter offered her. He shrugged his shoulders, and threw it into her lap, trying to look cool and careless, but failing entirely, for he was ashamed of himself, and out of sorts generally. Rose wanted to cry, but pride would not let her, and, being very angry, she relieved herself by talk instead of tears. Looking pale and excited, she rose out of her chair, cast away the ring, and said in a voice that she vainly tried to keep steady, "You are not at all the boy I thought you were, and I don't respect you one bit. I've tried to help you be good, but you won't let me, and I shall not try any more. You talk a great deal about being a gentleman, but you are not, for you've broken your word, and I can never trust you again. I don't wish you to go home with me. I'd rather have Mary. Good night." And with that last dreadful blow, Rose walked out of the room, leaving Charlie as much astonished as if one of his pet pigeons had flown in his face and pecked at him. She was so seldom angry that when her temper did get the better of her, it made a deep impression on the lads, for it was generally a righteous sort of indignation at some injustice or wrong-doing, not childish passion. Her little thunderstorm cleared off in a sob or two as she put on her things in the entry closet, and when she emerged she looked the brighter for the shower. A hasty good night to Aunt Clara, now under the hands of the hairdresser, and then she crept down to find Mary the maid. But Mary was out, so was the man, and Rose slipped away by the back door, flattering herself that she had escaped the awkwardness of having Charlie for escort. There she was mistaken, however, for the gate had hardly closed behind her when a well-known tramp was heard, and the prince was beside her, saying in a tone of penitent politeness that banished Rose's wrath like magic, "You needn't speak to me if you don't choose, but I must see you safely home, cousin." She turned at once, put out her hand, and answered heartily, "I was the cross one. Please forgive me, and let's be friends again." Now that was a better than a dozen sermons on the beauty of forgiveness, and did Charlie more good, for it showed him how sweet humility was, and proved that Rose practiced as she preached. He shook the hand warmly, then drew it through his arm, and said, as if anxious to recover the good opinion, with the loss of which he had been threatened, "Look here, Rosie, I've put the ring back, and I'm going to try again. But you don't know how hard it is to stand being laughed at." "Yes, I do. Ariadne plagues me every time I see her, because I don't wear earrings after all the trouble I had getting ready for them." "Ah, but her twaddle isn't half as bad as the chaffing I get. It takes a great deal of pluck to hold out when you are told you are tied to an apron string, and all that sort of thing," sighed Charlie. "I thought you had a deal of pluck, as you call it. The boys all say you are the bravest of the 7," said Rose. "So I am about some things, but I cannot bear to be laughed at.
It is hard, but if one is right, won't that make it easier? Not to me. It might to a pious parson like Arch. Please don't call him names. I guess he has what is called moral courage, and you physical courage. Uncle explained the difference to me, and moral is the best, though it often doesn't look so," said Rose thoughtfully. Charlie didn't like that, and answered quickly. "I don't believe he'd stand it any better than I do, if he had those fellows at him. Perhaps that's why he keeps out of their way, and wants you to." Rose had him there, and Charlie felt it, but would not give in just yet, though he was going fast, for somehow, in the dark, he seemed to see things clearer than in the light, and found it very easy to be confidential when it was only Rose. "If he was my brother, now, he'd have some right to interfere," began Charlie, in an injured tone. "I wish he was," cried Rose. "So do I," answered Charlie, and then they both laughed at his inconsistency. The laugh did them good, and when Prince spoke again, it was in a different tone, pensive, not proud nor perverse. "You see, it's hard upon me that I have no brothers and sisters. The others are better off, and needn't go abroad for chums if they don't like. I'm all alone, and I'd be thankful even for a little sister." Rose thought that very pathetic, and, overlooking the uncomplimentary word "even" in that last sentence, she said, with a timid sort of earnestness that conquered her cousin at once, "Play I was a little sister. I know I'm silly, but perhaps I'm better than nothing, and I'd dearly love to do it." "So should I, and we will, for you are not silly, my dear, but a very sensible girl, we all think, and I'm proud to have you for a sister. There now," and Charlie looked down at the curly head bobbing along beside him with real affection in his face. Rose gave a skip of pleasure, and laid one sealskin mitten over the other on his arm, as she said happily, "That's so nice of you. Now you needn't be lonely any more, and I'll try to fill Archie's place till he comes back, for I know he will, as soon as you let him." "Well, I don't mind telling you that while he was my mate I never missed brothers and sisters, or wanted any one else. But since he cast me off, I'll be hanged if I don't feel as forlorn as old Crusoe before Friday turned up." This burst of confidence confirmed Rose in her purpose of winning Charlie's mentor back to him, but she said no more, contented to have done so well. They parted excellent friends, and Prince went home, wondering why a fellow didn't mind saying things to a girl or woman which they would die before they'd own to another fellow. Rose also had some sage reflections on the subject, and fell asleep thinking that there were a great many curious things in this world, and feeling that she was beginning to find out some of them. Next day she trudged up the hill to see Archie, and having told him as much as she thought best about her talk with Charlie, begged him to forget and forgive. "I've been thinking that perhaps I ought to, though I am in the right. I'm no end fond of Charlie, and he's the best-hearted lad alive. But he can't say no, and that will play the mischief with him if he does not take care," said Archie in his grave, kind way. "While father was home I was very busy with him. So Prince got into a set I don't like. They try to be fast and think it's manly, and they flatter him, and lead him on to do all sorts of things, play for money, and bet, and loaf about. I hate to have him do so, and tried to stop it, but went to work the wrong way, so we got into a mess. He is all ready to make up if you don't say much, for he owned to me he was wrong, but I don't think he will own it to you in words," began Rose. "I don't care for that. If he'll just drop those rowdies and come back, I'll hold my tongue and not preach. I wonder if he owes those fellows money, and so doesn't like to break off till he can pay it. I hope not, but don't dare to ask, though perhaps Steve knows. He's always after Prince, more's the pity," and Archie looked anxious. "I think Steve does know, for he talked about debts of honor the day I gave him—" There Rose stopped short and turned scarlet. But Archie ordered her to fess, and had the whole story in 5 minutes, for none dared disobey the chief. He completed her affliction by putting a $5 bill into her pocket by main force, looking both indignant and resolute as he said, "Never do so again, but send Steve to me if he is afraid to go to his father. Charlie had nothing to do with that. He wouldn't borrow a penny of a girl, don't think it. But that's the harm he does Steve, who adores him, and tries to be like him in all things. Don't say a word. I'll make it all right, and no one shall blame you." "Oh, me! I always make trouble by trying to help, and then letting out the wrong thing," sighed Rose, much depressed by her slip of the tongue. Archie comforted her with a novel remark that it was always best to tell the truth, and made her quite cheerful by promising to heal the breach with Charlie as soon as possible. He kept his word so well that the very next afternoon, as Rose looked out of the window, she beheld the joyful spectacle of Archie and Prince coming up the avenue, arm in arm as of old, talking away as if to make up for the unhappy silence of the past weeks. Rose dropped her work, hurried to the door, and, opening it wide, stood there smiling down upon them so happily that the faces of the lads brightened as they ran up the steps, eager to show that all was well with them. "Here's our little peacemaker," said Archie, shaking hands with vigor. But Charlie added, with a look that made Rose very proud and happy, "And my little sister." Chapter 24. Which? "Uncle, I have discovered what girls are made for," said Rose, the day after the reconciliation of Archie and the Prince. "Well, my dear, what is it?" asked Dr. Alec, who was planking the deck, as he called his daily promenade up and down the hall. "To take care of boys," answered Rose, quite beaming with satisfaction as she spoke. "Phoebe laughed when I told her, and said she thought girls had better learn to take care of themselves first, but that's because she hasn't got 7 boy cousins as I have." "She is right, nevertheless, Rosie, and so are you, for the two things go together, and in helping 7 lads, you are unconsciously doing much to improve one lass," said Dr. Alec, stopping to nod and smile at the bright-faced figure resting on the old bamboo chair after a lively game of battledore and shuttlecock, in place of a run which a storm prevented. "Am I? I'm glad of that. But really, uncle, I do feel as if I must take care of the boys, for they come to me in all sorts of troubles and ask advice, and I like it so much. Only I don't always know what to do, and I'm going to consult you privately, and then surprise them with my wisdom." "All right, my dear. What's the first worry? I see you have something on your little mind, so come and tell uncle." Rose put her arm in his, and, pacing to and fro, told him all about Charlie, asking what she could do to keep him straight and be a real sister to him. "Could you make up your mind to go and stay with Aunt Clara a month?" asked the doctor when she ended. "Yes, sir, but I shouldn't like it. Do you really want me to go?" "The best cure for Charlie is a daily dose of rose water, or rose and water, or rose and water. Will you go and see that he takes it?" laughed Dr. Alec. "You mean that if I'm there and try to make it pleasant, he will stay at home and keep out of mischief?" "Exactly." "But could I make it pleasant? He would want the boys." "No danger but he'd have the boys, for they swarm after you like bees after their queen. Haven't you found that out?" "Aunt Plen often says they never used to be here half so much before I came, but I never thought I made the difference, it seemed so natural to have them round." "Little Modesty doesn't know what a magnet she is, but she will find it out some day," and the doctor softly stroked the cheek that had grown rosy with pleasure at the thought of being so much loved. "Now you see, if I move the magnet to Aunt Clara's, the lads will go there as sure as iron to steel. And Charlie will be so happy at home, he won't care for these mischievous mates of his, I hope," added the doctor, well knowing how hard it was to wean a 17-year-old boy from his first taste of what is called seeing life, which, alas, often ends in seeing death. "I'll go, uncle, right away. Aunt Clara is always asking me, and will be glad to get me. I shall have to dress and dine late, and see lots of company, and be very fashionable, but I'll try not to let it hurt me, and if I get in a puzzle or worried about anything, I can run to you," answered Rose, good-will conquering timidity. So it was decided, and without saying much about the real reason for this visit, Rose was transplanted to Aunt Clara's, feeling that she had a work to do, and very eager to do it well. Dr. Alec was right about the bees, for the boys did follow their queen, and astonished Mrs. Clara by their sudden assiduity in making calls, dropping into dinner, and getting up evening frolics. Charlie was a devoted host, and tried to show his gratitude by being very kind to his little sister, for he guessed why she came, and his heart was touched by her artless endeavors to help him be good. Rose often longed to be back in the old house with the simpler pleasures and more useful duties of life there, but having made up her mind, in spite of Phoebe, that girls were made to take care of boys, her motherly little soul found much to enjoy in the new task she had undertaken. It was a pretty sight to see the one earnest, sweet-faced girl among the flock of tall lads, trying to understand, to help and please them with a patient affection that worked many a small miracle unperceived. Slang, rough manners, and careless habits were banished or bettered by the presence of a little gentlewoman, and all the manly virtues cropping up were encouraged by the hearty admiration bestowed upon them by one whose good opinion all valued more than they confessed, while Rose tried to imitate the good qualities she praised in them, to put away her girlish vanities and fears, to be strong and just and frank and brave, as well as modest, kind, and beautiful. This trial worked so well that when the month was over, Mac and Steve demanded a visit in their turn, and Rose went, feeling that she would like to hear grim Aunt Jane say, as Aunt Clara did at parting, "I wish I could keep you all my life, dear." After Mac and Steve had had their turn, Archie and company bore her away for some weeks, and with them she was so happy she felt as if she would like to stay forever, if she could have Uncle Alec also. Of course, Aunt Myra could not be neglected, and, with secret despair, Rose went to the mausoleum, as the boys called her gloomy abode. Fortunately, she was very near home, and Dr. Alec dropped in so often that her visit was far less dismal than she expected. Between them, they actually made Aunt Myra laugh heartily more than once, and Rose did so much good by letting in the sunshine, singing about the silent house, cooking wholesome messes, and amusing the old lady with funny little lectures on physiology, that she forgot to take her pills and gave up Mum's elixir, because she slept so well after the long walks and drives she was beguiled into taking, that she needed no narcotic. So the winter flew rapidly away, and it was May before Rose was fairly settled again at home. They called her the monthly Rose because she had spent a month with each of the aunts, and left such pleasant memories of bloom and fragrance behind her that all wanted the family flower back again. Dr. Alec rejoiced greatly over his recovered treasure, but as the time drew near when his year of experiment ended, he had many a secret fear that Rose might like to make her home for the next 12-month with Aunt Jessie, or even Aunt Clara, for Charlie's sake. He said nothing, but waited with much anxiety for the day when the matter should be decided, and while he waited he did his best to finish as far as possible the task he had begun so well. Rose was very happy now, being out nearly all day enjoying the beautiful awakening of the world, for spring came bright and early, as if anxious to do its part. The old horse-chestnuts budded round her windows, green things sprung up like magic in the garden under her hands, Hardy flowers bloomed as fast as they could. The birds sang blithely overhead, and every day a chorus of pleasant voices cried, "Good morning, cousin. Isn't it jolly weather?" No one remembered the date of the eventful conversation which resulted in the doctor's experiment, no one but himself at least. So when the aunts were invited to tea one Saturday they came quite unsuspiciously, and were all sitting together having a social chat, when Brother Alec entered with two photographs in his hand. "Do you remember that?" he said, showing one to Aunt Clara, who happened to be nearest. "Yes, indeed. It is very like her when she came. Quite her sad, unchildlike expression, and thin little face, with the big dark eyes." The picture was passed round, and all agreed that it was very like Rose a year ago. This point being settled, the doctor showed the second picture, which was received with great approbation, and pronounced a charming likeness. It certainly was, and a striking contrast to the first one, for it was a blooming, smiling face, full of girlish spirit and health, with no sign of melancholy, though the soft eyes were thoughtful, and the lines about the lips betrayed a sensitive nature. Dr. Alec set both photographs on the chimney-piece, and, falling back a step or two, surveyed them with infinite satisfaction for several minutes, then wheeled around, saying briefly as he pointed to the two faces, "Time is up. How do you think my experiment has succeeded, ladies?" "Bless me, so it is!" cried Aunt Plenty, dropping a stitch in her surprise. "Beautifully, dear," answered Aunt Peace, smiling entire approval. "She certainly has improved, but appearances are deceitful, and she had no constitution to build upon," croaked Aunt Myra. "I am willing to allow that, as far as mere health goes, the experiment is a success," graciously observed Aunt Jane, unable to forget Rose's kindness to her Mac. "So am I, and I'll go farther, for I really do believe Alec has done wonders for the child. She will be a beauty in 2 or 3 years," added Aunt Clara, feeling that she could say nothing better than that. "I always knew he would succeed, and I'm so glad you all allow it, for he deserves more credit than you know, and more praise than he will ever get," cried Aunt Jessie, clapping her hands with an enthusiasm that caused Jamie's little red stocking to wave like a triumphal banner in the air. Dr. Alec made them a splendid bow, looking much gratified, and then said soberly, "Thank you. Now the question is, shall I go on? For this is only the beginning. None of you know the hindrances I've had, the mistakes I've made, the study I've given the case, and the anxiety I've often felt. Sister Myra is right in one thing. Rose is a delicate creature, quick to flourish in the sunshine, and as quick to droop without it. She has no special weakness, but inherits her mother's sensitive nature, and needs the wisest, tenderest care to keep a very ardent little soul from wearing out a finely organized little body. I think I have found the right treatment, and with you to help me, I believe we may build up a lovely and a noble woman, who will be a pride and comfort to us all." There Dr. Alec stopped to get his breath, for he had spoken very earnestly, and his voice got a little husky over the last words. A gentle murmur from the aunts seemed to encourage him, and he went on with an engaging smile, for the good man was slyly trying to win all the ladies to vote for him when the time came. "Now, I don't wish to be selfish or arbitrary, because I am her guardian, and I shall leave Rose free to choose for herself. We all want her, and if she likes to make her home with any of you rather than with me, she shall do so. In fact, I encouraged her visits last winter, that she might see what we can all offer her, and judge where she will be happiest. Is not that the fairest way? Will you agree to abide by her choice, as I do?" "Yes, we will," said all the aunts, quite in a flutter of excitement at the prospect of having Rose for a whole year. "Good. She will be here directly, and then we will settle the question for another year. A most important year, mind you, for she has got a good start, and will blossom rapidly now, if all goes well with her. So I beg of you, don't undo my work, but deal very wisely and gently with my little girl, for if any harm come to her, I think it would break my heart." As he spoke, Dr. Alec turned his back abruptly, and affected to be examining the pictures again. But the aunts understood how dear the child was to the solitary man who had loved her mother years ago, and who now found his happiness in cherishing the little Rose who was so like her. The good ladies nodded and sighed, and telegraphed to one another that none of them would complain if not chosen, or ever try to rob Brother Alec of his heart's delight, as the boys called Rose. Just then a pleasant sound of happy voices came up from the garden, and smiles broke out on all serious faces. Dr. Alec turned at once, saying, as he threw back his head, "There she is, now for it!" The cousins had been a-Maying, and soon came flocking in laden with the spoils. "Here is our bonny Scotch Rose with all her thorns about her," said Dr. Alec, surveying her with unusual pride and tenderness, as she went to show Aunt Peace her basket full of early flowers, fresh leaves, and curious lichens. "Leave your clutter in the hall, boys, and sit quietly down if you choose to stop here, for we are busy," said Aunt Plenty, shaking her finger at the turbulent clan, who were bubbling over with the jollity born of spring, sunshine, and healthy exercise. "Of course we choose to stay. Wouldn't miss our Saturday high tea for anything," said the chief, as he restored order among his men with a nod, a word, and an occasional shake. "What is up, a court-martial?" asked Charlie, looking at the assembled ladies with affected awe and real curiosity, for these faces betrayed that some interesting business was afloat. Dr. Alec explained in a few words, which he made as brief and calm as he could, but the effect was exciting nevertheless, for each of the lads began at once to bribe, entice, and wheedle our cousin to choose his home. "You really ought to come to us for mother's sake, as a relish, you know, for she must be perfectly satiated with boys," began Archie, using the strongest argument he could think of at the moment. "Ah, yes," she thought, "he wants me most. I've often longed to give him something that he wished for very much, and now I can." So, when, at a sudden gesture from Aunt Peace, silence fell, Rose said slowly, with a pretty color in her cheeks, and a beseeching look about the room, as if asking pardon of the boys, "It's very hard to choose when everybody is so fond of me. Therefore I think I'd better go to the one who seems to need me most." "No, dear, the one you love the best, and will be happiest with," said Dr. Alec quickly, as a doleful sniff from Aunt Myra, and a murmur of "My sainted Caroline," made Rose pause and look that way. "Take time, cousin. Don't be in a hurry to make up your mind, and remember, Codlin's your friend," added Charlie, hopeful still. "I don't want any time. I know who I love best, who I'm happiest with, and I choose Uncle. Will he have me?" cried Rose in a tone that produced a sympathetic thrill among the hearers, it was so full of tender confidence and love. If she really had any doubt, the look in Dr. Alec's face banished it without a word, as he opened wide his arms, and she ran into them, feeling that home was there. No one spoke for a minute, but there were signs of emotion among the aunts, which warned the boys to bestir themselves before the waterworks began to play. So they took hands and began to prance about uncle and niece, singing with sudden inspiration the nursery rhyme, "Ring around Rosie." Of course that put an end to all sentiment, and Rose emerged laughing from Dr. Alec's bosom, with the mark of a waistcoat button nicely imprinted on her left cheek. He saw it, and said with a merry kiss that half effaced it, "This is my ewe lamb, and I have set my mark on her so no one can steal her away." That tickled the boys, and they set up a shout of "Uncle had a little lamb." But Rose hushed the noise by slipping into the circle, and making them dance prettily like lads and lasses round a Maypole, while Phoebe, coming in with fresh water for the flowers, began to twitter, chirp, and coo, as if all the birds of the air had come to join in the spring revel of the 8 cousins.